Block 2. Bjorn nodded and motioned towards Roderick. He's the owner of the vessel. The girl turned to look at Roderick, her eyes widening in surprise. You own the thing? Roderick nodded. It's mine. She walked over to him as he remained seated. Roderick took a sip of ale as he looked up at her. In any other circumstance, the girl's behavior would be rather uncouth, but since she hailed from this remote village, it was best not to reprimand her. The girl's hair fell over one shoulder and Roderick marveled at how perfectly she matched the color of her dress. Well, hello there, young one, Roderick said, offering a friendly smile. I'm sorry, but I don't think we have met. The girl placed her hands on her hips and smiled back at him. Welcome to Ebonheim. I am Ebonheim. Roderick let his mouth hang as he was about to take another sip of ale. He glanced over at Engine, who was staring at him with an amused look on his face. He glanced around the room, but everyone else wore the same expression. I'm sorry, Roderick said, looking back up at the young girl. Ebonheim? The girl's smile grew even wider. Yes, she replied enthusiastically. You do realize that that's the name of this village, right? Roderick asked. Yes, and your name is Ebonheim? The girl furrowed her brow at him as if she was somehow offended by the question. I am Ebonheim. Roderick took a deep breath and exhaled loudly as he glanced back over at Engine. Engine, this girl does not look like she was born just yesterday and had her parents name her after the village, so did you allow her to change her name? Engine shook his head. Of course not. She has always been Ebonheim. Roderick set his ale mug down. What do you mean? I'm not following what you're saying. Engine leaned forward with a bemused look. Well, you always said you wanted to meet the goddess of this village. He nudged his head towards the girl atop the table. This is her. Roderick looked back at Ebonheim and she stared back at him with curious eyes and a big grin. Wait, Roderick stammered, unsure of what to say. Seriously? 16. Chapter 16, An Eccentric Merchant, Part 2. Roderick ruminated on everything that Engine had told him, taking a deep toke from his herb bundle and letting the fragrant smoke swirl around him as he exhaled slowly. The girl, Ebonheim, had left shortly after, mumbling something about déjà vu and not wanting to experience another interrogation so soon. The others had also left one by one to retire for the night, leaving only him, his bodyguard Simon, and Engine in the feast hall. I don't know if you and the others are lucky or foolish. Roderick shook his head and exhaled a cloud of smoke. But I'll ask you again what I had asked you last year. Why would you accept the governance of a new god when you had just left your homes and journeyed here because you didn't want to be lorded over by one anymore? Engine took a deep toke from his own herb bundle. She was lost and desperate to be acknowledged. Ebonheim had been rejected by every settlement she offered to represent. Though quite different from our own experiences with gods, we saw her as a kindred spirit. Roderick sighed and looked up at the ceiling. So you mean to try and live in harmony while licking each other's wounds? You could say that. HRMM. Roderick scratched his beard and looked over at Simon, who was leaning back against a wooden pillar. Simon, I trust your senses. What do you think of her? She is a genuine deity, Simon answered. Though her presence is weak compared to others I've seen. Well, even a weak god is better than no god protecting your settlement. Roderick leaned towards Engine. So, what boon has she bestowed upon the village? Engine sat up and walked to another room, returning shortly carrying something wrapped in cloth. He held the object out to Roderick. Roderick unwrapped the cloth and saw a small bundle of dark wood. He furrowed his brow as he inspected the lumber. Isn't this just hay? His eyes went wide. Don't tell me. Engine nodded. It is what you suspect. A piece of an ebon tree? There's nothing else quite like it. Roderick reached inside his pocket and pulled out his enchanted monocle and put it over his eye. Runes of light shimmered into view as the monocle began displaying the properties of the piece of lumber. His mouth hung agape as he read the information. This is remarkable. Its qualities are even greater than runite forged at Skoravik. He looked up at Engine. How did you manage to cut an ebon tree down? We've tried all that we could last year, even with the tools I provided. Engine sat back down. Ebonheim allowed us to harvest them. They fall like any other tree to our axes, yet it is more durable than runite. May I test this? Engine nodded. Go ahead. Outside, Roderick grabbed the piece of lumber and motioned for Engine and Simon to follow. They walked outside and Roderick set the piece of lumber on the ground. Simon, try cleaving through this. Roderick watched as Simon unsheathed his claymore. It was a gift Roderick had given him years ago, The blade was forged from runite and enchanted by high-ranked artificers. It was sharp enough to damage even the aurichalcum plates of a war strider. Simon raised the blade and swung, making a loud clang as the blade bounced against the ebonwood. Roderick heard Simon grunt in surprise. Engine whistled from behind them. Roderick leaned down and inspected the wood. The blade had cut into the bark and managed to carve a shallow gash that was as deep as the width of his thumb. This is incredible. He looked over at Engine. Is it still able to burn? Engine scratched his chin. The peculiar thing is that it burns 100 times longer than other types of wood. But when we crafted shields and armor with it, it could resist even magical fire. How is that possible? Engine shrugged. Divine will. The ebon trees have existed here long before it in history, and no one's been able to decipher its secrets until perhaps now. It was all thanks to Ebonheim that we finally managed to make use of the wood. Engine, do you realize how revolutionary this could be? Roderick asked, still mystified at what he just witnessed. Think of the implications, and the opportunities this could present for the village. Roderick's mind raced with thoughts and ideas of this new material entering the market. I would like to discuss this further. Engine chuckled and motioned for them to head back inside. Of course. The next day, Ebonheim looked up at the masked form of Roderick's bodyguard. The man had stood beside her during their meeting yesterday, never saying a word, yet always watching her. She had left early that evening because she didn't want to be bothered having to go through explaining herself again, but also she was very curious about the mechanical spider. Now she waited outside of the lone guest house in the village for Roderick to wake up so that she could ask him about his spider wagon. His bodyguard was standing outside looking as mysterious and stoic as the first time she's seen him. So, what's your name? She asked. The man turned towards her. My name? I have many names. My true name is unknown to the world. I am known by many others though. And I am called. He paused and seemed to struggle with his words. Simon. Ebonheim raised her eyebrow. Simon? You don't strike me as someone who'd answer to such a simple-sounding name. Simon's mask remained fixed. No, you're right. I am known by many names and my true name will remain unknown. What's with this fellow? He wasn't making any sense. It was better to just find out directly. Her eyes shimmered as she used her divine sight. Name, Simon. Status, healthy. Simon's attributes, intelligence: 20, perception: 28, resilience: 25, strength: 24, agility: 24, endurance: 23, charisma: 14, manipulation: 19, wit: 19, health: 300. 240 base, 40 profession, 20 item bonus. Mana, 225. He took a step back. What are you doing? Peeking. Your name really is Simon. Simon turned away and pulled down his hood. That's not my true name, but I'll allow you to continue using that when you refer to me. Ebonheim raised an eyebrow then shrugged. Okay. So, you're Roderick's bodyguard? How long have you known him? Long enough. He folded his arms over his chest. Do you work for him full-time or? She tilted her head in confusion. I'm not working for anyone. Simon stepped closer and lowered his voice. I protect Roderick because that's what Roderick wants me to do. Ebonheim blinked in surprise. So he doesn't pay you? I get paid, but I choose to serve Roderick for free. Ebonheim cocked her head. Why? You get paid, but you work for free? That doesn't make any sense. What do you mean? I have my own reasons. Without missing a beat, she dropped down into a deep squat on her tippy toes, her heels just barely hovering off the ground. She rubbed her temples and stayed in that position for a moment, taking a deep breath and collecting her thoughts, before looking up at him with narrowed eyes. Are you okay? Simon stared back at her. I said, that's what Roderick wants, not what he needs. She squinted her eyes. Okay, not really. This person's got bats in the belfry. Better change the subject. So, why do you wear a mask anyway? Simon scoffed. I've worn masks since the age of 10, even before Roderick found me and gave me a home. Why? Because I prefer to hide who I truly am. Because people find me unsettling. And if they don't like what I say, they can blame their discomfort on the mask rather than me. Well, whatever makes you happy. If you ever need help or anything while you're here, please come talk to me. She smiled warmly at him. It's nice to meet you, Simon. She held out her hand for a shake. Simon hesitated for a moment and shook her hand. The door abruptly opened and Roderick stepped outside. He wore a loose robe and had tousled hair. His face was haggard from sleep and he yawned. "Can't even have a moment's respite with the two of you babbling outside my door." He stretched his hands out. "Come on in." Ebonheim followed Roderick inside as Simon closed the door behind them. Roderick glanced over at her. "You've had breakfast already?" Ebonheim nodded. "I was waiting for you. I wanted to ask you about something." Roderick scratched his head. "Oh? Go ahead. Ask." She hesitated. "About the wagon you brought yesterday. The spider." Roderick let out a hearty chuckle. "Ah yes. The spider." "Yes, it's fascinating stuff. It's a prototype model and we're still developing the technology." "Why do you ask?" "Well, I wanted to know how you built it and how you made it move. Is it like a golem?" Roderick's eyes twinkled as he smiled at her. "You've got an eye for fine craftsmanship, Ebonheim. It is indeed a type of golem. The spider that I have is a cargo golem, specifically designed for carrying heavy loads and transporting goods." "So, how does this golem work?" she asked. That requires a bit of explanation and demonstration. Tell you what, after breakfast, we can head to my golem and I'll explain more there." After eating breakfast together, Ebonheim followed Roderick and Simon to the outskirts of town. A small group of children had gathered around the spider golem, which sat in front of an open field. Ebonheim approached the golem and ran her fingers along its metal exterior. "How did you build this?" She examined the joints carefully before turning her attention to the cockpit atop its head. Roderick leaned against the side of the golem and crossed his arms. "For starters, I wasn't the one that built this. I employed artificers specialized in crafting golems. They started by creating the basic framework from brass and steel plates. Then they used stronger material to reinforce certain areas where it is needed extra strength and durability." Ebonheim continued to examine the golem closely but also kept glancing over at Roderick curiously. Afterwards, Roderick continued, "The artificers then attached the magical parts. The engine, the power source, etc." He tapped the golem's leg lightly with his finger. "This part here contains a spring mechanism powered by a magical enchantment, which causes the entire golem to lift off the ground when the lever on top is depressed." Ebonheim's eyes widened and she gasped. "That's incredible. I'd love to learn how it all works." She grinned excitedly at Roderick before turning her gaze back towards the golem and continuing to run her hands along its surface. "What else does this golem do?" she asked. "Well, you can load things into its belly. For example, I use this to transport supplies between places or bring building materials to our construction sites." Ebonheim stopped examining the golem and turned toward Roderick with wide eyes. "So you mean this thing carries things?" Roderick chuckled and climbed atop the cephalothorax to pull one of the levers. The spider golem's abdomen slowly opened from the back. "Many things. Come on, I'll show you my wares." Roderick led her around the abdomen, which was twice as large as her hut. Her eyes widened at the sight of the various wares on display. Hesitantly, she entered the spider's abdomen. Intricate tapestries adorned the walls, glass vials filled with luminescent elixirs lined the shelves, and gleaming artifacts of unknown purpose lay scattered about. "Wow," she breathed, taking in the sight of the enchanted emporium. "These tapestries," Roderick explained, gently running his fingers over the vibrant threads, "tell stories of ancient battles and mythical creatures from faraway lands. Each one is a masterpiece, painstakingly woven by skilled artisans." Ebonheim reached out to touch the tapestries, but Roderick quickly stopped her. "Careful. These are delicate works of art, not meant for curious little hands." She withdrew her hand, nodding solemnly before something shiny caught her attention. "What's this?" She reached out to touch a small, ornate box resting on a nearby shelf. Roderick gently placed a hand on her shoulder, guiding her away from the box. "Ah, that's a rather delicate item, my dear. It contains a tiny, enchanted music box. The melody it plays can soothe even the most troubled of hearts, but it's quite fragile, so we must be careful with it." She nodded, her curiosity piqued. "What about this?" She pointed to a vial of swirling, shimmering liquid. "That," Roderick explained, "is a potion of rejuvenation. It has the power to restore one's energy and heal minor wounds. Quite valuable, indeed." As they continued to explore the chamber, Ebonheim peppered Roderick with questions about the various items and their origins. He regaled her with tales of his travels to distant lands, encounters with strange creatures, and the many adventures he'd had while collecting and selling his wares. She listened attentively as he spoke, hanging on every word he uttered. Her eyes brightened as he described his latest acquisition, a rare piece of armor crafted from an unknown alloy, which had been found deep in a hidden tomb beneath a forgotten ruin. She gazed at him with sparkling eyes. "You're such an interesting man, Roderick." He laughed heartily and patted her on the back affectionately. "That's me." The pair emerged from the spider's abdomen and walked over to the edge of the clearing. Simon glanced at Roderick and Ebonheim and cocked his head. "I'm surprised you haven't sold anything to her yet, Roderick." Roderick snorted. "What kind of person do you take me for? I'm not some charlatan who would take advantage of a goddess who knows nothing of trade and barter. Defamation, I say." He tossed his head back and let out a booming laugh. Ebonheim giggled and glanced over at Simon. "He's right, you know. I don't have the knowledge to judge the value of his wares. I'll leave that to Engine and the others." "So, how long are you planning on staying at our village?" "Oh, I plan to stay for a few more days," Roderick replied. "There are more things I'd like to discuss with the elders." "Is there anything I can do for you while you're here?" she asked. Roderick rubbed his chin. "Well, I do have something to ask you." Ebonheim blinked. "What is it?" Roderick leaned down until his face was close to hers. "Would you be interested in having more people flock to you within the next 2 years?" In the dim recesses of the mine, a ragtag band of miners toiled relentlessly. Their hands, calloused and cracked, grasped their pickaxes with grim determination. Flickering torchlight cast dancing shadows upon the walls, revealing the faces of the weary laborers. Sweat dripped from their furrowed brows, mingling with the dust and grime that caked their skin. Their breaths, heavy and labored, filled the oppressive air as they chipped away at the unforgiving rock. As each day passed, the miners delved deeper into the bowels of the mountain, guided by a persistent hope for more iron and copper ore veins now that their previous mine was sealed off. Their pickaxes, dulled by ceaseless use, struck the rock with rhythmic precision, a testament to their years of toil. The clangor of metal meeting stone echoed through the caverns. On a day that seemed no different than any other, a miner named Haver, his beard matted with sweat and dirt, took a moment's respite. As he rested his aching back against the cold stone wall, he noticed an odd glint in the torchlight. Curious, he stepped closer, squinting through the dim illumination to discern the nature of this peculiar anomaly. Haver's calloused fingers traced the rough surface of the wall, seeking the source of the glimmer. When his hand finally alighted upon a narrow vein of gleaming metal, his heart leapt into his throat. He dared not breathe, lest the vision vanish before his eyes. With trembling hands, he retrieved his pickaxe and struck the vein with a cautious, deliberate force. As the chisel split the rock, a cascade of golden shards tumbled to the floor, each one winking with a radiant light. Haver's breath caught in his chest, for there, exposed by the force of his blow, gleamed a narrow streak of gold snaking its way through the dark stone like a celestial ribbon, a vein so rich it seemed as though the very sun had bled into the heart of the mountain. "Haver, what have you found?" called Tessa, a young and spirited miner, her voice tinged with curiosity. She drew closer, her eyes widening in disbelief as they fell upon the glittering vein. Her breath hitched, and she whispered, "Gold. We've found gold." The other miners, drawn by the unmistakable tone of wonder in Tessa's voice, approached the scene. As one, they gazed upon the shimmering vein, their eyes reflecting the fire of newfound fortune. A hush fell upon them, as if they were standing in the presence of some ancient, revered deity. The silence was shattered by a jubilant whoop from Olaf, the elder miner whose once mighty frame had been whittled by time. By Ebonheim. "Gold, we've struck gold." His voice, ragged with age, filled the cavern with a triumphant, infectious glee. The miners erupted into laughter and cheers, their exhaustion momentarily forgotten as they basked in the golden glow of their discovery. Embraces and hearty backslaps were exchanged and the tunnel was transformed into a hive of frenetic activity as the miners chipped away at the rock, the gold vein beckoning them deeper into the earth like a siren's song. As the precious metal was painstakingly extracted, the miners worked in a feverish state, whispers of fortune and glory igniting their imaginations. 15. Chapter 17, Winds of Change. "I believe it is time for us to consider the possibility of opening your village to others," Roderick began, standing in the center of the feast hall. The sun filtered through the windows, casting long shadows over the gathered elders. "More people means more hands to work the land," more minds to innovate, and more resources to be shared. Ebonheim watched from her place on a raised platform, flanked by the village elders. She watched as Roderick paced back and forth, his hands gesticulating wildly to emphasize his points. Engine, the self-proclaimed head of the village, nodded in agreement. He's right, you know, if we bring more people here, we can strengthen our village, and our goddess will gain more followers. It's a win-win situation for all. Engine, your faith in Roderick's proposition is admirable, but we must be cautious, said Hilda, her voice strong and steady despite her age. Inviting the outside world into our village could also bring unwanted attention and danger. The feast hall echoed with the murmurs of agreement from some of the elders, while others nodded their heads in thought. Ebonheim watched the scene unfold before her, her golden eyes taking in every detail. She felt a strange sense of responsibility, knowing that her very existence was the reason for this gathering. Engine leaned forward, his green eyes narrowing as he addressed Hilda. I understand your concerns, Hilda, but we cannot hide from the world forever. With the resources we possess and the protection of Ebonheim, our village has the potential to become a thriving community. A gentle voice amongst the elders spoke up. I, too, see the value in Roderick's proposal. However, we must consider the dangers as well. Inviting outsiders into our village could threaten our way of life and the very existence of Ebonheim. I just don't see the point in inviting strangers into our village, Bjorn grumbled. His arms crossed over his broad chest. We've built this place on our own, and we've done just fine without outsiders meddling in our affairs. We've lived here for years, hidden and safe. Why risk that now? What's the point of inviting strangers into our home? Progress, Bjorn, Engine replied, his voice firm. We cannot stagnate. Our village has much to offer, and we have much to gain from the world. With Roderick's help, we can do so in a controlled manner. Thorson, stroking his unkempt beard, leaned forward. We are strong and resourceful, but we are few in number. If we want to thrive, we need more people. More people means more workers, more hunters, and more crafters. It also means more mouths to feed. But that's a challenge we can overcome together. Roderick flashed a smile, sensing an opening. Indeed, think of the possibilities. Ebonheim could become a hub of trade and culture, attracting the best minds and artisans from all over the continent. And as your village grows, so too will your goddess's influence. Roderick, it's not that simple, Sven began, his brows furrowed as he clasped his hands together tightly. We appreciate your offer, but inviting outsiders could disrupt the delicate balance we have. Bogdan, a stout elder with a bushy mustache, grumbled. Sven's right. We've been hiding for a reason. We've managed to survive and thrive without attracting unwanted attention. Why risk it all now? Bertram, a wiry elder with a sharp gaze, countered. But what kind of life is it if we live in fear, forever skulking in the shadows? We owe it to ourselves and our children to explore the possibilities. The debate continued, each elder voicing their thoughts and concerns. Roderick did his best to reassure them, detailing the benefits of trade and the potential for cultural exchange. He spoke of how their unique resources and connection to a benevolent goddess could make them an influential power in the region. Corina, a cautious elder, questioned the merchant. Roderick, how do we know that you truly have our best interests at heart? You're not one of us. Roderick paused before replying, his voice filled with sincerity. You're right, I'm not from Ebonheim, but I have traveled far and wide, and I know a special place when I see one. I believe in the potential of this village, and I only wish to help you achieve it. The discussion went back and forth, with no clear consensus in sight. Corina, an elder known for her practical nature, addressed the room. We're at an impasse, she declared. Perhaps it would be wise to take some time to reflect on this matter and reconvene later. Engine nodded, seeing the wisdom in Corina's suggestion. Agreed. Let us take a break and gather our thoughts. We will reconvene in 1 hour. As the elders dispersed, Ebonheim approached Roderick, her iridescent hair shimmering like a cascade of stars. What do you think so far? She asked. Roderick smiled, his blue eyes twinkling as he regarded her. I think they'll come around. It's not every day that someone offers to increase their numbers. That alone makes them curious about what they might gain. But, I understand their reservations. I really do. What you all have now, and what you could have if you choose to open your doors to outsiders, they're two different things, and you can't expect everyone to welcome change with open arms. Change comes slowly, and even then, there will always be those who resist. Ebonheim cocked her head to the side. Were you expecting things to turn out like this? Roderick shrugged slightly. It always happens, and it's not just because they see me as a merchant who only cares for profit. What do you mean? She asked. Roderick sat down on an empty chair. Well, I suppose I should explain. There's a saying in my homeland, a phrase which I find rather fitting here. It goes, the road to the abyss is paved with good intentions. Ebonheim tilted her head further, studying Roderick with newfound interest. I'm not sure I understand what you mean. It's a saying among the people of my country. It means that people who mean well can still cause harm. In other words, people's good intentions don't necessarily guarantee good results, and their actions can backfire, causing harm instead of good. Ebonheim's eyebrows rose. Oh, I don't like the sound of that. Do you mean to say that people like Roderick can cause problems? Roderick chuckled. I suppose you could say I'm the perfect example. I've spent most of my life trying to convince others to embrace change. Sometimes, though, I've found myself making more enemies than allies. People like me often put others in a defensive position, making them wary and distrusting. Ebonheim placed her hands on her hips. Well, I think it's not a bad idea to have more people around. But I trust the elders to make the right decision for our village. Roderick inclined his head in respect. I know. Thank you, Ebonheim. I simply wish to see your people flourish. If my proposal is accepted, I promise to do everything in my power to ensure the village's success. As they left the feast hall, she couldn't help but ponder the implications of the conversation. While she wanted the best for her people, the idea of opening the village to strangers was fraught with potential dangers. It would be a difficult decision, one that would undoubtedly shape their future. They all returned to the feast hall an hour later, each having taken time to reflect on Roderick's proposal. Ebonheim watched as they took their seats, the room tense with anticipation. Ionis, a thin man with a thoughtful expression, was the first to speak. I have considered Roderick's proposal, and I must admit it has merit. However, we cannot ignore the potential dangers of opening our village to outsiders. We must ask ourselves if the benefits are worth the risks. Engine countered Ionis's argument. We cannot live in fear of the unknown, Ionis. Our village has the potential to become a powerful force, and we cannot achieve that by remaining isolated. Let us not forget the reason we came together in the first place, Engine continued. We came together to escape the gods who have forsaken us and find a new path. We are a village of outcasts, and our strength comes from our unity and our shared purpose. Should we not extend the same opportunity to others? The room fell silent as Engine's words resonated with the gathered elders. The question hung in the air, a somber reminder of their past and the difficult choices that lay ahead. Thorson nodded in agreement. He's right. Who are we to deny others the opportunity to find a home here, as we once did? Our village was built by those who were cast out, and now we have the chance to offer sanctuary to others in need. Ebonheim's heart swelled with pride at Engine and Thorson's words. She knew that her people's strength came from their diversity and their shared history of struggle. Renford, a scholarly elder, adjusted his glasses and raised his voice. What of our traditions, our way of life? How can we ensure they are not lost in the midst of this growth you propose? Roderick spread his hands wide, as if embracing the room. Your traditions and culture are what make Ebonheim special. By sharing them with others, you can ensure that they are preserved and celebrated. And, in turn, you can learn from the newcomers as well, enriching your own understanding of the world. Adet chimed in. It is as Roderick says. We cannot ignore the potential benefits of opening ourselves up to the world. Our resources, the ebon trees, and the gold deposits. They could bring prosperity to our village, allowing us to improve our lives and provide better opportunities for our children. Gunter, a skeptical elder, countered. But at what cost? How much of our souls must we sell for this prosperity you speak of? Roderick spoke up once more. I understand your fears. I am not asking you to blindly embrace change, but rather to consider the potential for growth and the opportunities it may bring. I am confident that, together, we can navigate these challenges and emerge stronger for it. Ebonheim listened attentively, her eyes reflecting the flickering light of the nearby hearth. She recognized the passion behind each elder's argument, and the weight of responsibility they felt for the village's future. Franco, a diplomatic elder, offered a compromise. What if we were to start small? Allow Roderick to promote our village, but within certain limits. We could set terms, ensuring that we maintain control of our growth and that our traditions are not lost. The suggestion was met with thoughtful murmurs, as the elders considered the possibility of a more measured approach to Roderick's proposal. The merchant nodded, willing to work within their constraints. Elaine, a reserved elder who was also from the Jixishan tribe, spoke up. I am not opposed to this idea, but I worry about the consequences of opening our doors to the outside world. What if we attract the attention of those who wish us harm, or those who would seek to exploit our goddess and our resources? Bertram, a man with sharp eyes and a calculating mind, leaned forward. True, we must also consider the security of our village. Roderick, you claim that opening our borders will bring allies and connections. But what guarantees do we have that it will not also bring danger? Roderick met Bertram's gaze, unwavering. There are no guarantees, but I believe that the potential benefits far outweigh the risks. The key is to proceed with caution and wisdom. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall, and Ebonheim watched as the elders exchanged glances, the weight of the decision growing heavier. The debate continued, with each elder voicing their concerns and offering potential solutions. Ebonheim watched them closely, admiring their wisdom and dedication to their people. Brutsink, a stout elder with a grizzled beard, leaned forward. Roderick, if we agree to your proposal, what do you intend to do? How will you bring these people to our village, and how will you ensure our safety? Roderick scratched his beard, a thoughtful look in his eyes. First, I will spread the word of Ebonheim's existence and the opportunities it holds. I will use my connections with merchants and traders to establish trade routes and draw people to the village. As for safety, I propose setting up a system of checks and balances to ensure that any newcomers adhere to your laws and customs. Of course, I will defer to the wisdom of the elders and Ebonheim in all matters concerning the village. Sven spoke up. If we decide to proceed with Roderick's plan, how can we ensure that the outsiders we bring in will honor our ways and respect our goddess? Roderick's eyes flicked to Ebonheim, a respectful nod in her direction. You could establish a code of conduct, a set of rules that every newcomer must agree to follow. As the discussion continued, it was clear that the elders' positions were beginning to shift. Some who had initially been opposed to Roderick's proposal now considered the potential benefits more seriously, while others who had supported the idea from the outset began to acknowledge the risks involved. Brutson put forth a question. If we do decide to move forward with this plan, how can we ensure that we maintain our values and traditions? How do we strike a balance between growth and preservation? Roderick, prepared for this query, outlined his vision. By establishing a council that includes both elders and newcomers, we can ensure that all voices are heard and that decisions are made with the best interests of the village in mind. This council can work to preserve your traditions while also adapting to the changing world. I have an idea, Franco said suddenly, breaking the silence that had settled over the feast hall. What if we were to send a small group of our own to accompany Roderick? They could observe the newcomers and ensure that they are trustworthy before inviting them to join our village. The room buzzed with murmurs and thoughtful nods. Engine stroked his peppered beard, considering the proposal. That is a promising idea, Franco. It would give us some control over the situation without outright denying others the opportunity to join us. Ebonheim, ever watchful, felt the subtle shift in the room. She knew that the fate of her village rested in the hands of these wise men and women, and she trusted that they would make the right decision. Elaine, a gentle soul with a love for nature, looked to Ebonheim, his voice soft but clear. What are your thoughts, Ebonheim? Do you believe that opening our village to outsiders is the right path? Everyone turned their eyes to her, who had been quietly listening to the conversation. Ebonheim shifted uncomfortably in her seat, feeling the weight of responsibility pressing down on her. She had only recently learned of the existence of the outside world, and now her people were debating the prospect of inviting new inhabitants into their village. She swallowed, searching for the right words. I think it's not a bad idea. Everyone in the village came from different places. If we stay secluded for years or decades, then if outsiders show up one day, it might be harder for us to welcome them. But if we open ourselves to others starting now, we can build trust and familiarity with them from the beginning. That will make things easier later. And she trailed off. She couldn't finish her sentence. Instead, she glanced around at her elders, trying to convey her message with her eyes alone. The elders nodded, their faces thoughtful. You've given us food for thought, said Hilda, her tone calm and reassuring. Thank you for sharing your insight. I understand what you mean, and I believe the same way. Engine looked around the room, his green eyes sharp and discerning. It seems we are at a crossroads, Engine said. To embrace change and growth, or to hold fast to the way things have always been. I propose we put the matter to a vote. All in favor of adopting Roderick's plan, raise your hands. One by one, the elders raised their hands, signaling their agreement with the proposal. As the last hand was raised, a sense of unity filled the room. Though the decision had not come easily, they had reached it together, as one. Engine, his expression solemn, nodded. Very well. We shall move forward with Roderick's plan. We're not expecting an immediate influx of settlers soon. It'll probably take a couple of years at the earliest. During that time, the village can prepare to welcome them. So, steel yourselves, there's a lot more work to be done. Roderick, his face a mix of relief and determination, bowed his head. I am honored by your trust, and I will do everything in my power to ensure the success of this endeavor. Together, we will shape a brighter future for Ebonheim. With the decision made, the elders began discussing the logistics of implementing Roderick's plan. Hilda turned towards Ebonheim. This is a new beginning for our village, and I pray that it will bring us closer to the dreams we have held in our hearts. Ebonheim smiled warmly and nodded. Engine walked over and placed a hand on Ebonheim's shoulder. And you have the most work to do amongst all of us. You've been lacking in your administrative role, and although I am the head of the village, you need to start pulling your weight and help me with the daily tasks. Ebonheim blinked, her mouth wide open. 14, Chapter 18, Hello, Neighbor. Part 1, 15th Day of Whitehelm, 1367. 2 months had passed since Roderick and Simon left to continue their journey to the Western Kingdoms. During their stay, Roderick had traded all of the tools he had in stock as well as other wares for a small bundle of ebonwood. During that time, Engine had rigorously tutored her about the ways of governing a settlement. It took a while, but she had started getting the hang of it and even assisted him with some daily tasks. But today, she had been given a new mission, to build a road to the western entrance of the valley. It was first suggested by Roderick since traversing the forest took a toll for any traveler without a road to travel through. Engine had reaffirmed that it took a great deal of effort and time to find the grounds to settle in when they first arrived here. It's just building a road. How hard could it be? She reached into her mind and searched through the myriad of powers the Akashic system listed for her. Eventually, she found what she was looking for. Name, Path of the Earthen Passage. Effect, upon casting, you create a 5-meter wide, 100-meter long dirt road through a forest environment, starting at a point within range. The road is smooth and free of any impediments, such as protruding roots, rocks, or vegetation. Range, 20 meters. Duration, 24 hours. You must expend 5 quintessence to make the road permanent. Cost, 15 essence to cast. Would you like to spend 50 quintessence to acquire this ability? Of course. She purchased it and information about its use immediately flooded her mind. Once the memory had settled, she checked her remaining quintessence. Quintessence, 7,508 thousandths. Ebonheim crossed her arms over her chest and grumbled softly. She almost had enough to transcend to the next divine rank, but now she had to start spending some to create a road. Hopefully, the whole process wouldn't consume a lot, but she didn't know how far it was to the entrance of the forest. Well, only one way to find out. She sighed and headed off to start her work. Ebonheim's golden eyes narrowed as she surveyed the dense forest before her. All right, trees, she declared. It's time to make way for progress. Her iridescent hair shimmered as she raised her hands, the air around her crackling with energy. As she concentrated, the ground shook, and the trees seemed to part before her, roots retracting, trunks bending, and foliage rustling in acquiescence. Ha! She cried triumphantly. This is great. I can't wait to see their awed faces once the road is fully built. They're going to be so proud. She beamed, imagining all the praises to come her way. She skipped along the freshly cleared path, humming to herself as she went. She paused every so often to admire her handiwork. The newly formed dirt road snaking through the dense forest. Ebonheim's hands glowed with a warm, green light as she shaped the earth, careful to leave the trees and plants unharmed. The trees seemed to heed her call, branches swaying and twisting out of the path's way. Ebonheim moved gracefully, her silken white dress fluttering around her as she skipped along. She hummed a tune, her golden eyes shining with anticipation of the travelers her road would bring. As a few days passed, the dirt road grew longer, winding its way through the dense forest valley. Engine had told her to follow the markings they had left and it would guide the western entrance. Her enthusiasm never waned, her laughter echoing through the valley. Occasionally, Ebonheim would pause, admiring the beauty of her creation. The road was lined with flowers, some of which she had never seen before. She couldn't help but smile at the sight, and she often plucked a few blossoms to adorn her hair. The animals, sensing her benevolence, would often approach, watching her work with curiosity. Ebonheim would greet them warmly, offering a few strokes of her hand before resuming her task. The Akashic system chimed with a sudden message, warning. You are about to leave the boundary of your domain. You will receive a -20% penalty on all stats and abilities. If your manifested form is destroyed, there is a 10% that your divine spark will also be destroyed. As Ebonheim approached the end of her domain, she could feel the change in the air, a subtle shift in energy that marked the boundary of her influence. She paused for a moment, her brow furrowing as she considered the challenge that lay ahead. That's quite a scary message. It seemed like leaving her domain wasn't a sound idea and posed quite the risks, but it should be safe. She was a goddess after all and the forest should be relatively quiet. Well, she said, determination burning in her eyes, there's no turning back now. Time to venture into uncharted territory. With a deep breath, she stepped over the invisible boundary, her powers surging as she prepared to continue her work. She was met with resistance, however, as the trees beyond her domain seemed to stubbornly refuse her command. Oh, come on, she huffed, frustration mounting. Why won't you just move? As she continued to struggle, a deep, rumbling voice echoed through the forest, halting her efforts. You dare to command me, little goddess? Ebonheim blinked in surprise, her hands still raised, the green glow around them fading. She turned to face the source of the voice, her eyes widening as she took in the sight that awaited her. Before her stood a colossal tree, its trunk gnarled and twisted with age. Slowly, the bark shifted and rearranged, revealing two glowing eyes that seemed to bore into her very soul. Limbs creaked and groaned as the ancient tree unfurled its massive branches, taking on the semblance of arms and legs. It stepped forward, the ground shuddering beneath its weight, leaves rustling like 1,000 whispers. Ebonheim's eyes widened in awe, her iridescent hair rippling with excitement. Despite seeing it for the first time, somehow she knew what it was. Wow, you're an ant, she exclaimed, momentarily forgetting her frustration. I've never met one of you before. The ant's eyes narrowed, its voice like the grinding of stones. And I have never met a goddess who thought she could command my forest, it replied, its tone both stern and accusatory. Ebonheim hesitated, her hands falling to her sides. Oh, well, I didn't mean any disrespect, she stammered, her cheeks flushing a deep rose. I was just trying to make a road for my people. A road? The ant asked, its voice dripping with skepticism. What need have your people for a road through my domain? My village is nestled deep in the valley, and it's difficult for travelers to find their way through the forest, she explained, her golden eyes pleading. A road would make it so much easier for them to reach us. The ant regarded her thoughtfully, its eyes reflecting the sunlight that filtered through the canopy above. And what makes you think I would allow such a thing? It inquired, crossing its massive arms over its chest. Ebonheim shifted her weight from one foot to the other, her fingers nervously twisting in the fabric of her silken dress. I thought that maybe we could come to some sort of agreement, she ventured, her voice barely above a whisper. The ant let out a low chuckle, a sound like the rustling of leaves in gentle breeze. You are bold, little goddess, it said, a note of amusement in its voice. Very well, let us talk. Ebonheim's face lit up, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. Really? She asked, her excitement bubbling over. Thank you. I promise I'll do whatever it takes to make this work. The ant waved a branch, beckoning her to sit on a nearby moss-covered boulder. We shall see, it replied, lowering itself to the forest floor with a grace that belied its size. Now, tell me more about this road of yours. Ebonheim sat on the boulder and stared up at the colossal being, her mouth agape. The ant's eyes, two glowing orbs of green light, bore into her, and she couldn't help but feel a twinge of fear. But she was a goddess, after all. and she refused to be intimidated. She stood tall, mustering all the divine authority she could muster, and called out, "I am Ebonheim, goddess of the village south of here." "Who might you be?" The ant stared down at Ebonheim, its massive form casting a shadow over her. It took a moment to reply, its voice deep and resonant, like the wind blowing through the trees. "I am Elmsworth, guardian of the forest and protector of this realm. I have stood watch here for centuries, long before you came to be." Ebonheim floated up, bringing herself eye to eye with the ancient being. "Elmsworth, huh? Nice to meet you," she said with a smile, trying to lighten the mood. "I've been working on this road, and it's brought me to your lovely domain." Elmsworth's eyes narrowed as he glanced at the dirt road behind her. "Yes, I see that. You've certainly been busy," he replied, his tone dripping with disdain. Ebonheim ignored the ant's disapproval and continued cheerfully, "Isn't it great? So, as I was saying earlier, I'd like to extend my road through your territory, if you don't mind." "I need the road to reach the western entrance of the forest valley." Elmsworth snorted, a sound like branches snapping. "You young gods always think you know best," he grumbled, "but the forest has its own ways, and it does not need your meddling." Ebonheim crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing in irritation. "Well, I think it's a great idea, and I'm not meddling. I'm just trying to help my village." Elmsworth shook his head, his leafy hair rustling. "You may have good intentions, but you must learn to respect the natural order of things." Ebonheim huffed, her iridescent hair shimmering with annoyance. "Oh, I'm sure it'll be fine. I've been careful not to disturb any homes or habitats while constructing it. Besides, the forest is vast. Surely there's enough room for a simple road." The ancient ant stared at her, his glowing green eyes unblinking. They stood in silence, the only sound the gentle rustling of leaves and the babbling of the river nearby. The ant sighed, the sound like the rustling of leaves on a windy day. "You may be right, but I must still consider the matter carefully. There is much to think about before allowing such a change in my domain." Ebonheim perked up, a hopeful smile on her face. "Really? You'll let me build my road?" Elmsworth sighed, the sound like the creaking of ancient wood. "I did not say that. I said we shall talk. I will listen to your reasons, and then I will decide." Ebonheim nodded, eager for the opportunity. "Okay, that's fair. Thank you, Elmsworth." The two of them settled on the riverbank, Ebonheim's feet dipping into the cool water as Elmsworth lowered himself onto his massive root-like legs. They began to talk, exchanging stories of their respective domains and the creatures that lived within them. As they spoke, Ebonheim couldn't help but be captivated by the ancient ant's tales. He spoke of a time when the forest was young and the trees whispered secrets to one another. He told her of the great battles fought beneath the canopy, and the heroes who had come and gone. But as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow on the forest, Ebonheim knew she had to broach the subject of the road once more. "Elmsworth," she began, her voice gentle but firm, "I've really enjoyed our conversation, but I must ask you again. Will you let me build my road through your domain?" Elmsworth sighed, his breath rustling the leaves around them. "Ebonheim, I must admit, you are a charming and passionate young goddess. However, I still cannot allow you to build your road through my domain." Ebonheim frowned, her golden eyes pleading. "But why, Elmsworth? I've told you how important this road is to my village. It could bring prosperity and new opportunities for my people." The ancient ant shook his head, his voice firm. "The forest has existed long before your village, and it has its own ways. Building a road through my domain would disrupt the delicate balance of life here. But think of all the good it could do." Ebonheim insisted, her hands gesturing wildly. "We could create trade routes, connect distant kingdoms, and bring people together." Elmsworth snorted, its limbs creaking as it folded its arms once more. "And what of the creatures that call my forest home? The delicate balance of nature that has existed here for millennia?" Ebonheim hesitated, her enthusiasm dampened by the ant's words. "Well, I hadn't really thought about that," she admitted, her cheeks flushing with embarrassment. "But surely there must be a way to create the road without causing too much harm?" The ant's eyes narrowed, its gaze piercing. "And what guarantee do I have that your people will respect my forest once the road is built? That they will not chop down my trees and trample my flowers?" Ebonheim clenched her fists, her frustration growing. "But we can be careful. We'll make sure not to harm any of the creatures or plants that call your forest home." Elmsworth's green eyes bore into hers. You may have good intentions, young goddess, but you cannot foresee the consequences of your actions. Once the road is built, there is no turning back. Ebonheim huffed, her patience wearing thin. Well, what if we make a deal? I'll do something for you in exchange for your permission to build the road. Anything you want. The ant raised a massive brow, considering her offer. Anything, you say? Ebonheim nodded eagerly. Yes, anything. Just name it, and I'll do it. Elmsworth stroked his mossy beard, deep in thought. After a few moments, he finally spoke. Very well, Ebonheim. I propose a challenge. If you can best me in a contest of wits, I will allow you to build your road. Ebonheim blinked, taken aback by the unexpected proposal. A contest of wits? What do you mean? The ancient ant grinned, revealing a row of bark-like teeth. A battle of riddles, young goddess. If you can solve my riddles, then you may build your road. But if you fail, you must abandon your project and leave my domain in peace. Ebonheim hesitated, unsure if she was clever enough to outwit the ancient being, but the fate of her village hung in the balance, and she knew she couldn't back down. With a determined nod, she agreed. All right, Elmsworth. I accept your challenge. The ant and the goddess exchanged riddles, their banter filling the air with laughter and groans of frustration. Ebonheim found herself surprised by Elmsworth's humor and wit, despite his grumpy exterior, and while some of his riddles were undoubtedly ancient and perplexing, she managed to hold her own. However, as the contest drew on, it became clear that neither of them would emerge a clear victor. Their riddles and answers flew back and forth, the night growing darker as the stars appeared overhead. Finally, as the moon reached its zenith, Elmsworth held up a massive hand, signaling the end of their contest. Enough, Ebonheim. We have been at this for hours, and it seems we are evenly matched. I must admit, you have surprised me with your cleverness. Ebonheim smiled, feeling a sense of pride at the ant's words. So, what does this mean for my road? Elmsworth's expression grew serious, his eyes heavy with the weight of his decision. Ebonheim, your dedication to your village and your tenacity in our contest have impressed me. However, I still cannot permit you to build your road through my domain. Ebonheim sighed, her hands on her hips as she stared at the ant. Come on, can't we work something out? She implored, her eyes glimmering with determination. Elmsworth paused, considering her words. There is a task you could perform, young goddess. Deep within the forest, there is a grove of trees that has been tainted by a dark presence. If you can cleanse the grove and restore balance to the land, I will grant you permission to build your road through my domain. Ebonheim's eyes lit up at the challenge. A dark presence, you say? Consider it done, Elmsworth. I'll cleanse the grove and prove that I'm capable of handling the responsibility of the road. The ant nodded, the creaking of its branches echoing through the forest. Very well, young goddess. I shall await your return, and if you are successful, we shall discuss the road further. 17, Chapter 19, Hello, Neighbor. Part 2. Announcement. I'll be taking a break next week to rest my noggin. The next chapter will be published on Monday, May 15th. Sorry for the inconvenience. Ebonheim paced the edge of the feast hall, her iridescent hair shimmering with each step. Her fingers danced over the smooth wood of her ebon bow, her eyes searching the room for the elder she sought. A hush fell over the gathering as Hilda entered, her white hair cascading like moonlight over her shoulders. Ah, there you are, Hilda, Ebonheim said, breaking the silence. I need to talk to you about something important. Hilda raised an eyebrow, her blue eyes twinkling with curiosity. And what might that be? Dear goddess, she replied, her voice a rich, warm timbre. An ant called Elmsworth has given me a quest, Ebonheim said, her gold eyes flashing with determination. I need to cleanse a corrupted grove in his forest. It's the only way he'll allow us to build the road we need. Hilda's gaze sharpened, her face falling into a somber expression. Elmsworth, the ancient ant of the west? I've met him once before, over a winter ago. He's a wise and powerful being, but his trust is hard to earn. Ebonheim sighed, her shoulders slumping with the weight of her responsibility. I know, but our village needs this road, and I'll do whatever it takes to secure his favor. Hilda sat on her chair. Tell me more of this quest that Elmsworth tasked you with. Ebonheim recounted her encounter with the ant as the other elders listened in. Hilda furrowed her brow, concern etched on her features. If it's to cleanse a corrupted grove, it most likely has something to do with Lindra. Ebonheim tilted her head, Who's that? Someone you know? Hilda placed a wrinkled hand on Ebonheim's shoulder. I haven't met her personally, but I've heard of her plight from the other forest spirits that reside within Elmsworth's forest. They told me that she was a gentle and kind spirit who cared for all living things. Something must have happened to her, something that caused her to become corrupted. What could have caused her to fall so far from her original nature? Ebonheim asked. Hilda shook her head, her white hair swaying gently. I cannot say for certain, but I believe it may have been a dark force, an evil that has seeped into the heart of the grove and twisted Alindra into a malevolent being. Ebonheim's grip tightened on her bow, her resolve growing with each word. Then I must help her and cleanse the grove of whatever plagues it. Hilda's expression softened, a proud smile gracing her aged features. You have a kind heart, Ebonheim, and I know you'll do whatever it takes to save Alindra and the grove. Ebonheim's cheeks flushed at the praise. Thank you, Hilda. I won't let you, the village, or Elmsworth down, I promise. The elder placed her hand over Ebonheim's, her voice filled with warmth. I know you won't, dear goddess. Now, let me tell you more about the grove itself. Ebonheim listened intently as Hilda spoke, committing every detail to memory. As the sun dipped below the horizon and the feast hall filled with the soft glow of firelight, she prepared herself for the journey ahead. Thorsten and Bjorn awaited her as she exited the feast hall. You need us to come with you? Bjorn asked. We don't want another repeat of what happened at the mine, Thorsten added. They were both properly geared for battle. Ebonheim shook her head. I appreciate the offer, but no, I'm going alone. We don't know the details of the corruption and I can't risk you two getting hurt. Bjorn sighed, scratching the back of his neck. Very well, we'll do as you command, goddess. That's fine, we'll stay here and guard the village, Thorsten said, sounding rather disappointed. Just don't get yourself killed out there. Ebonheim laughed. No way that'll happen. Don't worry, I'll be back soon enough. The pair watched as she strode through the village, her gait brisk, her white dress billowing behind her. You worried? Bjorn asked Thorsten. Very. The sun had barely risen when Ebonheim, armed with her ebon bow and the knowledge Hilda had shared, set out to cross into Elmsworth's territory. The forest was still, its silence broken only by the gentle rustle of leaves and the distant song of a lark. As Ebonheim crossed the invisible border, she felt a subtle shift in the air, as though the very essence of the forest had changed. A whisper of wind brushed past her, carrying with it the faintest scent of pine and wildflowers. The trees seemed to lean in, their branches intertwining overhead, creating a canopy that bathed the forest floor in dappled sunlight. Ebonheim couldn't help but marvel at the beauty around her, the serenity that Elmsworth's domain seemed to exude. As she ventured deeper into the forest, she began to encounter the creatures that called it home. A family of deer grazed in a nearby clearing, their ears flicking at Ebonheim's approach. Before deciding she posed no threat, a squirrel chattered at her from a high branch, its bushy tail twitching with curiosity. She even caught sight of a majestic white stag, its antlers a tangled crown of branches that stretched toward the heavens. Ebonheim moved through the forest with reverence, careful not to disturb the delicate balance that Elmsworth had cultivated. As she spent a good part of the morning walking, she started to realize that she was lost. The way to Alindra's grove was forgotten even after Elmsworth and Hilda had told her. With no other guide to follow, she kept wandering and hoping to stumble upon her destination. The sun had climbed high into the sky when Ebonheim came upon the first sign that something was amiss. A solitary tree, its leaves wilted and blackened, stood like a blight upon the otherwise pristine landscape. As she approached, she could feel the tree's pain, its once vibrant energy now tainted and twisted. Ebonheim laid a hand upon its trunk, murmuring a soft word of comfort. I'll find the source of this corruption, she promised. I'll cleanse this grove and restore your beauty. As she continued on her path, the whispers of the forest seemed to grow louder, their voices a mixture of sorrow and anger. Ebonheim strained to understand the words, her heart aching with empathy for the forest's plight. It was clear that Alindra's influence had spread far beyond the grove, her corruption seeping into the very heart of Elmsworth's domain. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon when Ebonheim felt a gentle tug on her sleeve. She turned, her eyes widening in surprise as she beheld a tiny, ethereal figure that had appeared beside her. Its body seemed to be made of leaves and vines, its delicate wings shimmering like gossamer in the fading light. Greetings, a goddess. I am Ivera, a spirit of this forest, the creature said, her voice the gentle rustle of leaves on the wind. I know of your quest, and I wish to help you find the corrupted dryad and cleanse our home. Ebonheim's heart swelled with gratitude, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. Oh, thank the gods, she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. I was so lost. I think I've been walking in circles for hours, and I was about to shout Elmsworth's name and ask for directions again. Ivera's spindle-shaped eyes blinked. What? Did you get lost? That's wonderful. Oh, I should have known you'd figure out a way to get lost in a place like this. Don't worry, I'll take you straight to the Alindra's grove. It was Ebonheim's turn to look confused. Pardon? Did this sprite just make fun of her? Ivera giggled, her leafy body shaking with mirth. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to be rude. Come, I'll show you the way. With a nod, Ivera took to the air, leading Ebonheim deeper into the woods, toward the heart of the corruption and the fate that awaited her there. Ebonheim followed Ivera through the dense forest, the sun's rays growing weaker as they ventured deeper into Elmsworth's territory. The once vibrant foliage now appeared sickly, the leaves tinged with a sinister darkness. The whispers of the forest grew more insistent, their voices warped and unsettling, like the echoes of a nightmare. Ivera flitted ahead, her tiny body radiating concern as they neared the source of the corruption. We're close now, she murmured, her voice trembling. I can feel the grove's pain, its despair. Ebonheim's grip tightened on her ebon bow, her eyes scanning the shadowed woods for any sign of danger. I'm ready, she whispered, her voice filled with resolve. Whatever it takes, I will cleanse this grove and free Alindra from her torment. As they continued on their path, the forest seemed to close in around them, the twisted branches forming a suffocating embrace. Ebonheim could sense the tree's anguish, their once harmonious song now a discordant cacophony of pain and fear. A question formed in Ebonheim's mind, one that had been gnawing at her ever since she had set foot in Elmsworth's domain. She glanced at Ivera, her expression troubled. Ivera, there's something I've been wondering, she began, her voice hesitant. Why hasn't Elmsworth cleansed the corruption himself? Surely, as the lord of this forest, he has the power to do so. Ivera paused in midair, her wings fluttering softly as she considered the question. Elmsworth is ancient and wise, she said slowly, her voice thoughtful, but even he has his limits. Alindra's corruption has spread too deep, too quickly, for him to combat on his own. He has tried to heal the grove, but his efforts have only slowed the spread of the corruption, not stopped it. Ebonheim nodded, taking in the sprite's words. But why me? She asked, her voice tinged with uncertainty. I'm grateful for the opportunity to help, but I'm no powerful deity. I'm still learning about my own abilities. Ivera smiled gently at Ebonheim, her luminous eyes filled with warmth. Sometimes, it is not raw power that is needed, but a compassionate heart and a strong will. Elmsworth believes in you, as do I. We have faith that you will succeed where others might falter. Really? Thank you for having faith in me. I'll do everything in my... Ivera squinted at her eyes and interrupted. No, I was just flattering you. Honestly, I don't know why he decided to ask for your help. It's like asking an ant to stop a forest fire. Ebonheim felt the vein on her forehead begin to throb. Oh, well, I'll do my best anyways. The whispers of the forest seemed to grow quieter, their voices a twisted symphony of sorrow and rage. Ebonheim strained to understand their words, her heart heavy with the weight of Alindra's influence. What do they say, Ivera? Ebonheim asked, her eyes searching the shadows for the sprite. Ivera hovered nearby, her expression grim. They speak of Alindra's transformation, the darkness that has consumed her heart, she replied, her voice barely audible above the whispers. They mourn for the loss of their guardian and the grove that once flourished under her care. The whispers seemed to grow quieter, as if acknowledging her pledge, and Ebonheim felt a renewed sense of purpose. With Ivera at her side, she continued onward, her eyes set on the heart of the grove and the darkness that awaited her there. As they delved further into the corrupted grove, Ebonheim spotted a small, ethereal figure flitting between the twisted branches of a nearby tree. The figure appeared to be another forest spirit, its body shimmering with a soft, green light. It glanced warily at Ebonheim and Ivera before approaching them with a curious tilt of its head. Who are you, and why have you come here? The spirit asked, its voice delicate and wavering. Ebonheim stepped forward, her expression resolute. I am Ebonheim, goddess of the village that bears my name, she replied. I have come to cleanse this grove and free Alindra from the corruption that has taken hold of her. The spirit regarded Ebonheim with a mixture of surprise and hope. You are brave to venture into this darkness, it said softly. But I fear the task you have set before yourself is not an easy one. Alindra's corruption runs deep, and the source of her torment is unlike anything we have ever encountered. What is it? Ebonheim asked, her brow furrowing in concern. What has caused her to fall so far from her true nature? The spirit hesitated, its eyes filled with sorrow. We believe the source of the corruption is a strange device that has become lodged within Alindra herself, it explained. It is unlike anything we have seen before, a mixture of magic and technology that seems to feed on her very essence, twisting her powers and turning her against the grove she once protected. Ebonheim furrowed her brow. Magitech, she whispered, her voice filled with dread. But how did such a device come to be within the Dryad? Who would do such a thing? The spirit shook its head, its expression pained. We do not know. The device appeared suddenly, and its effects were swift and devastating. Elmsworth has tried to remove it, but the corruption has spread too quickly, and he has been unable to reach Alindra herself. Then I will find a way to remove the device and free Alindra from its influence, she vowed, her voice strong and unwavering. It's not the first time I had to deal with something corrupted. The spirit gazed at Ebonheim with newfound respect, its eyes alight with hope. If anyone can succeed in this task, Ebonheim, it is you, it said softly. Alindra's fate, and the fate of this grove, now rest in your hands. Ebonheim's eyes shimmered from the praise but still held her breath to see if the spirit turned it around as Ivera did earlier. Nothing. This one was genuine. She looked over at Ivera and smiled with pride, to which Ivera just shrugged and gave a faint smile as well. As Ebonheim and Ivera continued their journey towards the heart of the corrupted grove, guided by the forest spirit, it told of the tale between Elmsworth and Alindra. The spirit paused, its gaze distant, as if lost in memory. Long ago, Alindra and Elmsworth were close allies. Their bond a testament to the harmony that once existed between our forest and the Ents domain. They worked together to nurture the grove, their combined power creating a haven for all who dwelled within. The spirit's voice caught, the weight of her grief evident in her words. But now she has become corrupted. The darkness consumed her, transforming her into the twisted creature that now haunts these woods. Just as the spirit finished speaking, a guttural roar echoed through the grove, followed by the sound of branches snapping and the earth trembling beneath their feet. Ebonheim's heart raced as she readied her ebon bow, her eyes scanning the darkened forest for the source of the disturbance. What was that? She whispered, her voice tense with anticipation. The spirit's face paled, its eyes wide with fear. Something is coming, it breathed, its voice barely audible. Something terrible. 15. Chapter 20. Hello, neighbor. Part 3. A chilling gust of wind blew through the grove, carrying with it the distant echoes of the corrupted creature's guttural roars. Ebonheim readied her bow, her eyes scanning the darkened forest for the source of the disturbance. Beside her, Ivera fluttered anxiously. The sprite's usual glow dimmed in the face of the impending threat. The forest spirit that was with them faded out of the material realm, its body disappearing in a swirl of leaves and branches. Enchanted Essence Bolt, Rank 2, activated. Essence, 190, greater than 170. 6 charges remaining. 6 leaf-shaped ethereal lights manifested behind her shoulder as she channeled her Enchanted Essence Bolt. Stay close, Ivera, she whispered. The sprite nodded, her tiny wings fluttering nervously. She took refuge in the goddess's hair, her body a cold pinprick against Ebonheim's scalp. The first creature to emerge from the darkness was an abomination, once perhaps a bear, now a hulking machine of flesh and twisted metal. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and steam hissed from the contraption on its back. It roared, a sound that was more mechanical than animal, and lunged for Ebonheim. Ebonheim moved fluidly, sidestepping the attack and letting her essence bolt fly. The bolt struck the creature's chest and exploded in a brilliant burst of light and energy. The creature roared in pain, its flesh melted, and the metal on its back warped and cracked. Despite her weakened state from being outside her domain, the divine energy still proved effective against corrupted creatures. Out of the mangled underbrush, more corrupted animals emerged, their forms twisted and grotesque. Metal protruded from their flesh, their eyes glowed with a sickly green light, and a chilling mechanical hum accompanied their movements. A pack of corrupted wolves, their bodies misshapen and covered in thick, chitinous plates, slunk out of the undergrowth, growling and snapping at her. Ebonheim loosed a bolt into the pack's midst, its ethereal light exploding across the creatures' bodies, but the beasts only redoubled their efforts. Ebonheim readied her bow again. Her face grim as she took aim and let fly. The essence bolt struck a wolf in mid-leap, its head exploding in a shower of blood and gore. From her vantage point, Ivera called out, "Ebonheim, don't you have more powers?" Ebonheim didn't hesitate. Raising her free hand, she invoked her forest's call, her voice a melodic chant that carried over the growls and roars. Divine ability. Forest's call cannot be activated in this domain. Her eyes widened. That wasn't good. Was it because she was within the corrupted grove, or was it because this was outside her domain? Her enchanted essence bolt was working, so did that mean she was only barred from using powers that affected the forest? "I can't use some of my powers right now," she stated. This complicated things a bit, but she could still fight. The corrupted bear, recovering from Ebonheim's attack, lunged at her again. Ebonheim rolled away, narrowly avoiding its claws, and quickly loosed another essence bolt. It struck true, exploding on the creature's face, and with a bellowing roar, it fell. Suddenly, a corrupted stag, its eyes gleaming with a strange, unnatural light, charged towards her. Ebonheim turned, but it was too late. The impact knocked her off her feet, sending her sprawling onto the ground. "You've taken 17 kinetic damage. Health 190, greater than 173. Gritting her teeth against the pain that flared in her side, Ebonheim rolled, narrowly avoiding the stag's antlers as it lunged at her. She scrambled to her feet, her hand closing around the shaft of her bow. She fired another essence bolt, the divine projectile cutting through the air to sear through the stag's side. It collapsed, the light in its eyes fading away. Ebonheim took a moment to catch her breath. The wolves, however, continued their assault. They were agile, circling around her, snapping at her legs and back as she maneuvered through the forest. A wolf leapt at her from behind, its jaws wide and ready to snap, and Ebonheim spun around and swung her bow, hitting the wolf on its head, the impact staggering it. Another wolf lunged at her. "Ivera!" she shouted as she deflected its bite with her bow. "A little help here?" The sprite bobbed her head. "I probably should," she responded, fluttering out of Ebonheim's hair and into the air. Ebonheim watched as the sprite danced around a pair of corrupted wolves, her tiny form a blur of motion. She danced between their snapping jaws, leading them on a merry chase while her tiny hands glowed with a soft light. Along Ivera's path, images of fluffy rabbits flickered into existence around the wolves that chased her. She laughed as one by one they started chasing after their phantom prey. "Did that help?" Ivera asked. "Yeah, that's a big help." Ebonheim strained as she kept the wolf's mouth wedged with her bow as it continued to reach for her. "I can't hold this thing off forever. Can you help me out with this one too?" "Of course, Ebonheim," the sprite said, floating closer to the creature. She extended her hands towards the beast and let loose a bolt of light, its ethereal tendrils wrapping themselves around the wolf's torso. The wolf thrashed and growled, but its strength flagged as Ivera's power held the creature in place. Ebonheim quickly dispatched the wolf with a final bolt to the head. The last of the glowing leaves floating behind her shoulder faded out, signifying that her enchanted essence bolt had no more charges. "That's 4, Ivera said. "Are you going to be okay to take care of the rest?" Ebonheim nodded, activating her enchanted essence bolt once more. 6 new leaves of ethereal light sprouted behind her. Enchanted essence bolt, rank 2, activated. Essence, 170, greater than 150. 6 charges remaining. Power flowed from the bow, seeping into her veins, and she rose, her golden eyes ablaze. She pulled back her bowstring and her divine energy coalesced into the form of a radiant arrow. Time seemed to slow as she took aim. The snarling wolves a mere backdrop to the singular point of her focus. She released the essence bolt, the world exploding back into motion as it streaked towards its target. The arrow hit true, striking a wolf in the neck and exploding into a flash of blinding golden light. She loosed another essence bolt, and then another, each one finding its mark. The corrupted wolves fell one by one, their bodies crumpling to the ground. Finally, the last of the corrupted creatures fell, The forest once again silent but for the creaking of the trees and the soft murmur of the wind. Ebonheim sagged, the adrenaline leaving her in a rush. "Are you okay?" Ivera asked, hovering beside her. Ebonheim nodded. "I'm fine, thanks for the help." Ivera sighed. "If you're already struggling here, then I'm not sure how well you'll fare with saving Alindra." Ebonheim shrugged. "She's been corrupted by a Magitech device, but if she's not mindless and hostile like these animals, then I'll find a way to return her to normal." Ivera nodded, but her face still showed concern. Ebonheim reached out and took the sprite's hand. "I'll figure something out, you'll see." "All right, I'll trust you on this." "We should get moving then." Alindra awaits. Into the heart of the tainted grove they trekked, the usual songs of the forest replaced by an eerie silence. As they broke through a thicket of brambles, they reached a clearing, the center dominated by a large, twisted tree that stood taller and more grotesque than the others. It was around this tree that the corruption seemed most potent. The ground beneath it blackened and lifeless. At the base of the tree, hunched over and shrouded in a miasma of corruption, was a figure. Ebonheim's heart clenched at the sight, a pit forming in her stomach. It was Alindra. The dryad's skin had taken on a sickly hue, patches of it replaced with gleaming metal. Her hair was a tangle of vines and leaves, her eyes a haunting, vacant green. A filigree of wires tethered her to the tree. Ebonheim took a step forward, her hand reaching out to the dryad, but Ivera's tiny hand on her arm stopped her. "Ebonheim, wait," the sprite said, her voice filled with fear. "It's too dangerous. If you get close, you could get corrupted too." "It's all right," Ebonheim replied. "I'll be fine. Just stay back." Ebonheim's gaze fell on the dryad once more and saw a faint glow emanating from Alindra's chest, a pulsating light that beat in time with the dryad's shallow breaths. The Magitech device. "Hang on, Alindra. We're here to help," Ebonheim called out, her voice firm yet gentle. The dryad didn't respond, her vacant eyes staring blankly ahead, but as Ebonheim drew closer, a low growl rumbled through the grove, the ground beneath them shaking. The dryad's form shifted, her body twisting and contorting as she turned to face Ebonheim. The Magitech device in her chest glowed brighter, and with a chilling scream, Alindra lunged at her. Ebonheim was ready. She sidestepped the attack, her hand reaching to draw her bow, but she hesitated. She couldn't kill Alindra, she was here to save her. She needed another way. "Ebonheim, look out." Ivera's warning came just in time. Ebonheim ducked, a gnarled branch swiping over her head. She rolled away, putting some distance between her and the corrupted dryad. "Ivera," she called out, her eyes never leaving the dryad. "The device. I need to get to it." Ivera's eyes widened in understanding. "I'll distract her, you go." With a nod, Ebonheim readied herself. This was their only chance. As Ivera darted forward, her magic sparking to life, Ebonheim charged. Alindra's attention was on the sprite, her attacks wild and unfocused. Ebonheim closed the distance. She reached out, her hand closing around the Magitech device, and then, everything went black. "You've taken 40 arcane damage." "Health, 173, greater than 133. Ebonheim's fingers barely brushed the device when a force like a lightning bolt coursed through her, hurtling her backward. She crashed into the underbrush some distance away, her head spinning and her hand stinging from the contact. "Hey, you okay?" Ivera fluttered over, her tiny face etched with concern. Ebonheim sat up gingerly, rubbing the back of her head. She looked at her palm. The flesh seared as if she had just grasped a lump of hot coal. "I've been better," she muttered. "That thing's got some serious protection on it." She looked over and saw that Alindra had returned to her vacant state. It looked like she only became hostile if they got too close. Even the animals around the grove looked dazed, meandering around aimlessly and ignoring their presence. Turning to Ivera, Ebonheim said, "We need to remove the device." "But how?" Ivera fluttered anxiously. "Look what it did to you." Her mind raced, bits and pieces of information jumbling together. The Magitech device was causing the corruption, but how? Was it releasing some sort of energy? Was it manipulating the natural magic of the grove? And if so, how could they stop it? Ebonheim's gaze flitted back to the device, her brow furrowing. "I'm not sure, but I think." Her voice trailed off as she activated her divine sight. Divine sight, rank 2, activated. Essence, 150. Greater than 145. The world around her transformed. She could see the rivers of energy flowing through the grove, converging on Alindra. Intricate webs of arcane energy swirled and pulsed around the Magitech device. But she could also see something else, a pattern, a rhythm to the pulse. Ebonheim's gaze was drawn to the flow of energy, watching as it twisted and contorted, bending to the will of the Magitech device. Something about it seemed systematic, like it was following some kind of pattern. A set of rules. Ebonheim? Ivera's voice broke through her thoughts. What do you see? It's like a dance, she said, her brow furrowing in confusion. The energy around Alindra. It's moving in a pattern. A pattern? Ivera fluttered closer, her light reflecting in Ebonheim's wide eyes. What kind of pattern? I'm not sure. It's not natural. Ebonheim paused, struggling to find the words. It's mechanical. Mechanical? Ivera's wings fluttered nervously. Like the device? Yes, Ebonheim nodded, her gaze still locked on the flow of energy. I think the device is controlling it. But how do we stop it? Ivera asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Ebonheim admitted. Ebonheim turned to face the Dryad again, her eyes fixed on the device. Maybe if I can break the pattern, I might be able to free her from the device. Easier said than done. She had no clue where to start. Maybe if she was more familiar with Alindra and the Grove, she'd have a better idea of how to start. Ivera, I need your help. I need you to tell me everything you know about this Grove, about Alindra. Everything. Ivera hesitated, a flicker of fear passing over her face. But then she nodded, her tiny shoulders lifting in a shaky breath. Okay. Ivera began to share her knowledge of the Grove, of Alindra, of the rhythm of life that had once flowed harmoniously here. Ebonheim listened, her eyes still locked onto the pulsating device lodged in the Dryad's chest. The sprite's words wove a tapestry of the Grove's life, the symbiosis between its flora and fauna, and the part Alindra played in it. The sprite spoke of seasons, of cycles, of life and death and rebirth. She spoke of the way Alindra would hum lullabies to the seedlings in the spring, her voice coaxing them from their slumber. She spoke of the birds that would nest in Alindra's branches, the squirrels that would scamper along her limbs, the deer that would seek shelter under her leaves. The Grove used to thrive, Ivera said, her voice wavering. Alindra was its heartbeat, its soul. But now? Ebonheim nodded, a grim understanding in her eyes. This device, it's taken over. I think it's controlling the rhythm, the cycle. What does that mean? How can that device control the rhythms of nature? I don't understand either, Ebonheim confessed as the pieces began to fall into place. But I think the device is creating a new rhythm, a new pattern, one that's unnatural, unbalanced. Ebonheim looked over at Alindra once more and peered at the Magitech device lodged in her chest. Her eyes widened as she saw something that she hadn't noticed at first glance since she was focused only on the arcane energies flowing around the Dryad. There were symbols etched into the air in front of the device. She squinted, trying to make out the details. Each symbol pulsed and twisted in time with Alindra's heartbeat, a rhythm that seemed to echo through the entire Grove. Wait, there are also symbols in front of the device, Ebonheim said. What do they mean? Ivera asked, her light dancing across Ebonheim's eyes. Do you recognize them? They're numbers, Ebonheim replied as she stared at them intently. The numbers glowing in an eerie sequence. And they're not just glowing, they're changing, almost as if, like it's counting. Counting? Ivera gave a puzzled look. Ebonheim nodded. Yeah, like it's following a set of rules. An equation, maybe? What's an equation? Ivera asked. Ebonheim was hard-pressed to answer since she had only learned about the concept from having listened to Roderick's brief explanation of how Magitech devices like his mechanical spider wagon worked. After he had left, Engine started teaching her about mathematics, stating that it would be useful in the future when she would take a more active role in managing the village. It was all a lot to take in and she barely understood half of his lessons. Though at all, she'd been skeptical of its value. But maybe it could prove its use here. It's a bit hard to explain, she answered, but I learned from a friend of mine that the enchantments inside Magitech devices rely on complex equations to work properly. If I can figure out how that device is working, I might be able to disable it. Great. Come on then, figure it out already. I'm thinking. From what she's observed so far, webs of arcane energy flowed throughout the Grove and converged to Alindra. The device emitted a pulse that had some sort of pattern to it, but the symbols pulsed in tandem with Alindra's heartbeat. There was something there. Ebonheim frowned, taking a step back to take in the whole scene. She focused her attention and traced the flow of energy that branched off of the dryad. It flowed to the trees, but not to all of them. It flowed to different types of animals, but only those within a certain distance of the dryad. When an animal wandered too far away, the energy connected to it switched to a different animal nearby. The corrupted trees, the corrupted animals, Alindra. Suddenly, a realization dawned on her. The equation isn't just on the device, she said slowly. It's the grove. What do you mean? Ivera asked, floating closer. Ebonheim took a deep breath, piecing together her thoughts. Look around. The number of corrupted trees, the variety of corrupted animals. Since the grove is a part of Alindra, they're all parts of the equation, and her heartbeat. I think it's a constant in this equation. Ivera blinked at her, then looked around the grove. So how do we change the equation? Ebonheim's gaze hardened as she looked back at Alindra, an idea taking root in her mind. We change the grove. If this equation is based on the grove, we change the factors it's counting, and maybe that will give us a way to reverse the corruption. 16. Chapter 21, Hello, Neighbor. Part 4. Ebonheim stood at the edge of the clearing, her gaze sweeping over the corrupted grove. The twisted trees, the corrupted animals, the pulsating device lodged in Alindra's chest. Each piece of the puzzle was right in front of her. But how did they fit together? Her divine sight allowed her to see the arcane energy that emanated from Alindra, but more specifically from the Magitech device lodged in her chest. The energy flowed like a river, branching off from Alindra and weaving through the grove. Ebonheim focused on the trees first, tracing the flow of energy to each one. She counted silently, her brow furrowing as she realized the extent of the corruption. Next, she turned her attention to the animals. They were harder to count, their forms shifting and changing as they moved throughout the area. There were more corrupted trees than animals, but while the animals were fewer in number, their corruption was more potent, the energy around them pulsating with a darker hue. She looked back at the device and found the sequence of numbers that correlated to the number of trees and animals. However, there were still two sets of numbers that were unknown to her. One of them could be related to Alindra's heartbeat. An idea popped into her mind on how to figure out the remaining mystery. Ivera, she called, I need you to do something for me. The sprite fluttered over, her tiny face filled with concern. What is it? What can I do to help? I need you to lure a few animals away from the grove, Ebonheim explained. Huh? What for? Earlier, when an animal wandered off the grove, the energy connected to it vanished. I didn't look at the numbers on the device at the time, so I didn't see what changed. So now I need you to lure a few animals away while I watch the device. Can you do that? Ivera looked doubtful. I can try placing a charm spell on them to guide them away. I've done it before, so I know it still works on them, but are you sure that this will do something? I'm not, Ebonheim admitted, but it's worth a try. With a sigh and a nod, Ivera flew off, her tiny form disappearing into the underbrush. Ebonheim watched her go, then turned her attention back to the grove. She focused on the device, watching the numbers change as Ivera led the animals away. As the numbers shifted, there was no change in Alindra. The dryad remained still, her vacant eyes staring blankly ahead. The corruption was still there, as potent as ever. However, she noticed that the numbers on the device associated with the number of corrupted animals in the grove diminished. One of the unknown sets of numbers also diminished. A short while later, Ivera returned, flying over to land beside Ebonheim. Alright, I got lured some of them away. Just so you know, they go crazy and hostile once they left the area and after my spell wore off. Maybe that's why those animals attacked us earlier. Ebonheim nodded. Yeah, maybe. She turned her attention back to Alindra and narrowed her eyes as she studied the device again. How many animals did you manage to lure? 2 deers, 3 squirrels, and a rabbit. 6 animals. Ebonheim looked at the numbers once more and saw that the amount matched how much the numbers represented the number of animals linked to the device. She shifted her attention to the unknown set, expecting the number to be 3 less, and it was. I think I have an idea now, she said softly. Well, don't just keep it to yourself. Ivera fumed. What is it? Sorry, Ebonheim said sheepishly. The numbers in front of the device represent the number of corrupted trees and animals linked to it. Some of the numbers also represent the types of animals, and maybe even the types of trees in the group. I'll have to look at each one to be sure. The last bit of numbers must represent Alindra's heartbeat since it didn't change. Ivera tilted her head in confusion. Alright. So now that you've figured all of that out, can you save Alindra? I have a few ideas to try. First, I want to see if having fewer corrupted trees compared to the number of corrupted animals linked to it would have any effect. You mean to destroy the trees? Ivera gasped. Ebonheim nodded firmly, readying her bow. I don't know how Alindra will react, but be prepared for any retaliation. It didn't sit well with her, having to destroy trees that still had a chance to be cleansed, but she'll devote some time to regrowing the damage done even if Elmsworth didn't ask her to. But what about the animals? Ivera asked, her eyes wide with fear. Won't they attack us? Ebonheim paused. She hadn't considered that. If they saw her attacking the trees, they might see it as a threat and attack. We'll have to be careful, Ebonheim said, lowering her bow. If that happens, can you try distracting them? Ivera gulped. Only if a few of them attack. If you put the whole grove into a frenzy, then you're on your own. Ebonheim smiled grimly and lifted her bow once more. Let's hope they don't make things difficult. She activated her enchanted essence-built power once more, and 6 leaf-shaped sigils of light manifested behind her shoulder. She took aim at a corrupted tree, her fingers steady on the bowstring as light flared into existence, shaping into the form of her arrow. The essence-built cut through the air, a streak of divine energy that hit the tree with a resounding crack. The tree shuddered, its branches shaking as the energy coursed through it. Then, with a deafening roar, it exploded, shards of wood and energy scattering in all directions. Ebonheim didn't wait to see the aftermath. She knocked another divine arrow and let it fly, then another, and another. Each essence bolt found its mark, each tree exploding in a burst of energy, though the larger ones took 3 or more shots to destroy. As she worked, she kept a close eye on the animals in the grove, expecting them to attack. But the animals seemed to be ignoring her attacks altogether in their stupor. They continued to wander aimlessly. Ebonheim continued destroying the corrupted trees and watched their number dwindle on the device. But it wasn't enough. There were still too many corrupted trees compared to the number of corrupted animals, and she didn't have the essence to continuously use her enchanted essence built to bring the number of trees down further without waiting hours for her energy to replenish. She did notice a change in the number she thought only corresponded to the types of animals, which meant that the number also took into account the types of trees the device was linked to. She tried piecing it all together once again. There were more corrupted trees than animals, but each one was less than the number representing the types of animals and trees corrupted. The number representing the types of trees and animals corrupted was less than the combined amount, which made sense since multiple animals or trees of the same type were in the group. Finally, Alindra's heartbeat was less than the number representing the different types of trees and animals corrupted, but not by much. If all these factors were necessary to keep the grove corrupted, what if it was all reversed? She turned to Ivera, her voice steady despite the uncertainty gnawing at her. We need to lure more of the animals into the grove. Ivera's eyes widened. What? You just told me to lure them out of the grove earlier. Now you want me to lure them back in? Ebonheim smiled apologetically. Sorry, I don't have the essence to destroy enough of the trees unless you want to sit around while I recuperate my energy. Instead, I want to get more of the corrupted animals back in here. You won't do it alone this time. I'll go out too. We also need to make sure not to add more types of animals than what's already present here. Ivera crossed her arms in front of her and grumbled. Alright, fine. But just so you know, I'm also running low on mana, so this had better work. Ebonheim nodded and focused on accessing the Akashic system. She needed something similar to Ivera's magic that could charm the animals. Glowing words shimmered into view in front of her. Name, charm animals, rank I. Effect, this ability allows you to temporarily charm animals within a certain radius, influencing their behavior and making them friendly and cooperative towards you. Range, 10-meter radius. Target, animals within range. Duration, 1 hour. Cost, 10 essence. Would you like to acquire this ability for 50 quintessence? It'd be a good investment, so yes. Quintessence, 7,508, greater than 7,458. Acquired divine ability, charm animals, rank I. Perfect. This was much more efficient to use than her essence built, and if it came down to it, she could use herself as bait and corral the animals back here. Ebonheim and Ivera split up, each heading in a different direction. Ebonheim moved with purpose, her eyes scanning the forest for any signs of corrupted animals. She moved quietly, her steps light and careful. She didn't want to startle any potential targets. She found a corrupted fox first, its fur matted and its eyes glowing with an unnatural light. It snarled at her approach, but Ebonheim held up her hands in a placating gesture. She reached out with her will, and soft, soothing energy calmed the fox's aggression. With a gentle push of her power, she guided the fox back towards the grove. It moved reluctantly, its body tense and ready to bolt, but Ebonheim kept her magic steady, her presence a calming force that kept the fox from fleeing. She repeated the process with a corrupted badger and a pair of corrupted birds, each one adding to the number of animals in the grove. Each time she returned, she checked the numbers on the device. The number representing animals was increasing, but it was still less than the number of corrupted trees. Meanwhile, Ivera was having her own success. She returned to the grove with a corrupted bull trailing behind her, its snout twitching nervously as its hooves thudded against the ground. The creature's eyes glowed bright yellow and its mouth hung open. Following the bull was a corrupted hawk, crow, and sparrow, her magic guiding them into the grove. She was panting heavily, her wings fluttering weakly. I think that's all I can do," she said, her voice weak. I'm out of mana." Ebonheim patted the sprite's head lightly. "Good job." She looked back at the device. The number of corrupted animals was now greater than the number of corrupted trees, but the number representing the variety of species was still greater than the dryad's heartbeat. In order to bring the number below the threshold, she needed to reduce the types of trees corrupted by 3. Okay, the last thing to do is see how many types of trees are corrupted, then destroy enough so that there are 3 fewer types. And then Alindra will be saved? Ivera asked. "I'm hoping," Ebonheim replied. Ebonheim turned her attention to the corrupted trees, her gaze sweeping over the twisted forms. Each one was different, the corruption twisting and warping them into grotesque parodies of their former selves. But beneath the corruption, the essence of what they once were still remained. She moved closer to the nearest tree, her hand reaching out to brush against the gnarled bark. The tree shuddered under her touch, a low groan echoing through the grove. Ebonheim pulled her hand back, her brow furrowing as she studied the tree. It was an oak, its once mighty branches now twisted and gnarled. The leaves were a sickly yellow, the veins glowing with a faint, eerie light. Ebonheim moved on to the next tree, a birch. Its bark was blackened and cracked, the leaves shriveled and lifeless. One by one, she examined each tree, her mind cataloguing the different species: oak, birch, ash, pine, maple, willow, elm, yew, and hawthorn. 9 different species, each one corrupted and twisted. Her gaze fell on the hawthorn trees. There were only a few of them, their twisted forms standing out amongst the others. They were the fewest of a given type. If she destroyed them, it would reduce the number without causing too much damage to the grove. Ebonheim activated her enchanted essence bolt once more and drew her bow, her fingers steady on the string. She took aim at the nearest hawthorn tree, her breath steady as she let the arrow fly. The arrow struck true, the tree shuddering as the divine energy coursed through it. With a deafening crack, the tree exploded, shards of wood and energy scattering in all directions. As the last tree fell, Ebonheim lowered her bow and looked over at the Magitech device. The number representing the animals remained greater than the number of trees, and the variety of trees and animals was now less than the dryad's heartbeat. The pattern of energy emanating from Alindra and the device changed to a more subdued rhythm, a more natural flow. That should be it. Ebonheim let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. The conditions had been met. The grove should be cleansed. But nothing happened. Ebonheim frowned. Her gaze locked on the device. The numbers were right. The conditions had been met. So why wasn't the grove cleansed? Ebonheim? Ivera's voice was soft, filled with worry. What's wrong? Why isn't it working? I don't know, Ebonheim admitted, her voice filled with frustration. The conditions have been met. The grove should be cleansed. Maybe it needs a push, Ivera suggested. Like a burst of mana or something? Ebonheim paused, considering the sprite's words. It was possible. The device was magical, after all. Maybe it needed a magical trigger to deactivate. With a nod, Ebonheim raised her hand, her essence gathering at her fingertips. She focused on the device, her essence reaching out towards it. She could feel the corruption, the twisted arcane energy that pulsed from the device. But beneath it, she could also feel the natural magic of the grove, the life energy that had been suppressed by the corruption. With a deep breath, Ebonheim released her essence. It surged forward, a wave of pure, cleansing energy that washed over Alindra. It collided with the device, the impact sending a shock wave rippling through the grove. For a moment, everything was still. Then, slowly, the device began to glow. The light grew brighter and brighter until it was almost blinding. Then, with a final, brilliant flash, the light faded. Ebonheim blinked, her eyes adjusting to the sudden darkness. She looked at the device. The numbers were gone. The device was deactivated. She reached out, her hand closing around the device. This time, there was no shock, no force hurling her backward. Instead, the device felt cold, lifeless. With a firm tug, she pulled the device free. Alindra let out a gasp, her body shuddering as the device was removed. The corruption receded, the sickly glow fading from her skin. The dryad slumped forward, her body limp. Ebonheim caught her arms wrapping around the dryad's frail form. A soft gasp drew her attention. She turned to see Ivera, her eyes wide with awe. "Ebonheim, look." Ebonheim followed her gaze, her breath catching in her throat. The grove was changing, the corruption was fading, the twisted trees straightening and the animals shaking off their unnatural metallic shells. The grove was returning to its natural state, but the most dramatic change was Alindra. The dryad was glowing, her body radiating a soft, green light. The metal patches on her skin were receding, replaced by healthy, vibrant bark. Ebonheim let out a breathless laugh, relief washing over her. Alindra's eyes fluttered open, the vacant look gone. She looked at Ebonheim, her gaze filled with confusion and fear. What happened? You were corrupted," Ebonheim explained gently. "But you're safe now." Alindra's gaze drifted to the device in Ebonheim's hand, her eyes widening in horror. That was in me?" Ebonheim nodded, her grip on the device tightening. "But it's over now. The grove is safe." Alindra let out a shaky breath, her body sagging against Ebonheim. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you." Ebonheim smiled. They had done it. They had cleansed the grove. The corruption was gone. The grove was safe, and Alindra was free. As she held the dryad, Ebonheim looked around at the grove. The trees were regaining their natural color and shape. The metallic filigree covering the animals had vanished, leaving behind healthy fur and flesh. The ground around them had returned to its normal grassy brown. Ivera flew over and hugged Alindra's arm, a soft coo coming from her lips. Ebonheim let go of Alindra and watched as both of them embraced. Ebonheim looked at the magic-etched device on her hand, its intricate spherical surface gleaming in the dim sunlight. Part of her wanted to completely destroy it here and now, but it didn't seem to pose any threat anymore, and destroying it could potentially cause something worse to happen. She had never seen anything like it before, not even amongst Roderick's wares. Maybe she could ask him if he knew anything about it whenever he comes back from another visit. Either way, she should store this device somewhere safe and secluded before it could cause any more harm. Here is a whip map of the Elder Grove Valley. Only the location of the village, as well as Elmsworth's territory, are noted. Don't mind the scale of the trees in comparison to the mountains, rivers, lakes, etc. I'm still debating on the size of the valley, but I intended it to be very large and takes 10 days of travel on foot to traverse from one side to the other. I'd have to calculate how much someone can travel within a forest that has no roads, trails. Spoiler, collapse. 11. Chapter 22, A Road to a New Horizon. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows through the ancient forest. The air was filled with the scent of pine and damp earth, a symphony of bird songs echoing through the trees. Ebonheim and Ivera stood before the colossal form of Elmsworth, the ancient Hind who served as the guardian of the forest. His bark-like skin was dappled with a golden light filtering through the canopy above, and his eyes glowed with a soft, green light. "Ebonheim," he rumbled, his voice echoing through the trees, "you have done well. The forest sings with joy, and the corruption has been purged. For this, you have my thanks." Ebonheim beamed, her golden eyes sparkling with pride. "It was the least I could do as your neighbor," she said. "My village has a saying, a friend in need, a friend indeed." Elmsworth's eyes, two glowing orbs of green light, bore into her. "Indeed, you have," he rumbled. "You have proven yourself to be a goddess of your word, Ebonheim smiled and placed her hands behind her as she looked up at him with while doing her best impression of a cute puppy expecting a treat. I'm glad to hear you say that. So, about that road. Elmsworth let out a low chuckle, a sound like the rumble of distant thunder. Impatient as ever. I see, he said, a note of amusement in his voice. Very well. You may build your road through my domain. Ebonheim's eyes widened, a grin spreading across her face. Really? She exclaimed, unable to contain her excitement. She let out a whoop of joy, her iridescent hair shimmering as she spun around. Thank you, Elmsworth. Thank you. Thank you. Elmsworth raised a massive hand, silencing her. However, he continued, his voice stern, there are conditions. You must respect my domain and its inhabitants. Any harm caused by those who travel your road will be your responsibility. Ebonheim nodded. That seemed like a fair enough condition. I understand, Elmsworth. I promised to uphold my end of the agreement. Good. Elmsworth rumbled, his eyes softening. Then we have an understanding. Her eyes sparkling with joy, she turned to Ivera who was floating nearby. Did you hear that? Ebonheim exclaimed. I can build my road. Ivera rolled her eyes, a smirk playing on her lips. We heard, Ebonheim, she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. It's not like Elmsworth's voice is quiet or anything. Ebonheim stuck her tongue out at Ivera, causing the sprite to laugh. Oh, hush, you, she said, her eyes twinkling with mirth. This is a big deal. The aunt's gaze shifted to Ivera, who stood a little way off, her arms crossed over her chest. And you, Ivera, he rumbled. You have also played a part in this. Your guidance and wisdom have been invaluable. Ivera's lips curled into a small smile, her icy blue eyes twinkling. I merely offered advice, she said, her voice cool and calm. Ebonheim did all the hard work. Ebonheim shot Ivera a playful glare. Oh, don't be so modest, Ivera, she chided, her tone light. You were a big help, whether you admit it or not. Ivera rolled her eyes but said nothing, a faint blush coloring her cheeks. As they spoke, a soft rustling sound echoed through the forest, and Alindra, the dryad, emerged from the trees. Her green eyes were bright, her skin glowing with a newfound vitality. She moved with a grace that was captivating, her every step in harmony with the rhythm of the forest. Elmsworth's gaze then turned to Alindra. And you, Alindra, he said, his voice softening, you have endured much. Your strength and resilience are commendable. Alindra bowed her head, her hands clasped before her. Thank you, Elmsworth, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I am just grateful to be free of the corruption. She then stepped forward, her eyes meeting Ebonheim's. Ebonheim, she said, her voice soft. I wanted to thank you for everything. You've saved not just me, but the entire grove. Ebonheim smiled, reaching out to gently touch Alindra's arm. I'm just glad I could help, Alindra, and I'm glad to see you're doing well. Elmsworth made a sound as if clearing his throat, drawing their attention. As touching as this is, there is still one matter that remains unresolved. Ebonheim turned to face him, her brow furrowing. What's that, Elmsworth? Elmsworth's eyes narrowed, his gaze turning to Alindra. The device that was embedded in you, he said, his voice grave. How did it come to be there? Alindra's expression darkened, her gaze dropping to the ground. I'm not sure, she admitted. I remember a group of humans came to the grove. They were different, not like the villagers from Ebonheim's domain. They wore strange clothes and carried odd devices. They did something to me. I've no memory of what happened afterward. When I woke up, I was in Ebonheim's arms. Ebonheim glanced between Alindra and Elmsworth. This wasn't good news. And these humans, Elmsworth continued gravely, his voice grim. Do you recall anything about them? Their faces, their names? Alindra shook her head. No, I'm sorry. I wish I could tell you more. Elmsworth frowned, the corners of his mouth pulling downward. That's unfortunate, he said after a moment. When did all this happen? Ebonheim asked. Elmsworth turned to face her. 4 seasons ago was when I noticed the taint on the grove. Did you sense any intrusion in your domain during that time? Ebonheim pressed. Elmsworth gave a slow shake of his head. Nothing, he said softly, his expression darkening further. My senses are limited, unlike those of a god. Unless an event causes a great disturbance, the passing of mortal creatures through my forest goes unnoticed. Ebonheim frowned as she considered this. It seemed like a dead end for now. Perhaps they'd find a lead somewhere else. Alindra placed her hands over her chest where the device had been embedded. "Do you think they'll come back?" she asked quietly. "We cannot rule out that possibility," Elmsworth said slowly, his gaze drifting back to Alindra. "But I will make certain precautions are taken should any inkling arise. You should do well to do the same for your domain, Ebonheim." Ebonheim nodded, then glanced at Ivera. "Ivera?" she asked. "Have you any thoughts about all this?" Ivera shook her head, her eyes narrowing in thought. "Not sure," she said. "The only strange thing I've seen recently was a human riding on top of his mechanical spider. He travels through the forest once in a while, but I've kept a close eye on him and I haven't seen him do anything suspicious." "She must be talking about Roderick." "I know of him," Ebonheim said. "His name is Roderick and he's a traveling merchant that passes through my village. I don't think he's involved, but I could ask him about the device the next time he comes over." Elmsworth inclined his head. "That would be wise. But for now, I believe our discussion has reached its conclusion. I will leave you to your duties, Ebonheim." "Thank you, Elmsworth." "And I will be sure to keep an eye out." Elmsworth nodded, giving a brief bow before he turned to walk away. His lumbering footsteps soon faded into the forest. Alindra followed suit after thanking her one last time, leaving Ebonheim and Ivera alone. As soon as they were gone, Ebonheim turned to Ivera, her eyes sparkling with excitement. "Hey, want to watch me build my road?" Ivera blinked at her. "What?" she asked, confused. "You want me to come along with you?" Ebonheim grinned. "Of course, I'll get bored otherwise." Ivera rolled her eyes, shaking her head. Sure. Let's go then." The sun was just beginning to peek over the horizon, casting a warm, golden glow over the forest as Ebonheim and Ivera set off. The air was crisp and cool, filled with the sweet scent of dew-kissed leaves and the gentle rustling of the trees. Ebonheim's hands glowed with a soft, green light as she gently coaxed the earth and trees to make way for the road, her movements graceful and precise. Ivera fluttered around her, her tiny wings leaving a trail of sparkling dust in her wake. Her voice was soft and melodic, a stark contrast to Ebonheim's bold and boisterous tone. "Are you sure this is the right way, Ebonheim?" Ivera asked, her tiny brow furrowed in concern. "The forest is dense here, and the trees are old and strong. It won't be easy to convince them to move." Ebonheim chuckled, her golden eyes twinkling with amusement. "I've been told that nothing worthwhile is ever easy. But don't worry, I've got this." She raised her hands, her fingers tracing intricate patterns in the air. The ground beneath them trembled, and the trees slowly began to part, their branches swaying and twisting out of the path's way. Ivera let out a low whistle, her eyes widening. "That's impressive." Ebonheim gave her a pleased smile. "You haven't seen anything yet. I've got a lot more tricks up my sleeve." As they worked, the two of them shared stories and laughter, their bond growing stronger with each passing day. Ebonheim used her powers to shape the land while Ivera provided moral support and occasional commentary. They laughed and chatted, their voices echoing through the forest. She found herself growing fond of the sprite. Her cheerful disposition and playful teases were a welcome presence in the often lonely task of road building. As time passed, the road grew longer, winding its way through the dense forest and towards the western entrance of the valley. Ebonheim's enthusiasm never waned, her laughter echoing through the valley as she worked. Finally, after a couple more days of hard work, they reached the western entrance of the valley. Ebonheim stood at the edge of the forest, her eyes wide with awe as she took in the sight before her. The valley opened up into vast open plains, rolling hills stretching out as far as the eye could see. A few scattered trees dotted the landscape here and there, their branches swaying gently in the breeze. The sky above was a brilliant blue, unmarred by clouds, and the sun shone brightly, casting a warm glow over the landscape. A cool breeze wafted through the valley, carrying with it the scent of meadows and flowers. As she stood there, looking out over the vast expanse of land, Ebonheim felt a sense of accomplishment wash over her. Her first task was done. She had built a road through the forest in hopes of connecting her village to the outside world. But as she looked out over the plains, a sense of uncertainty crept in. What would this new connection bring? Would it bring prosperity and new opportunities for her village, as she hoped? Or would it bring unforeseen challenges and dangers? She shook her head, dispelling the doubts. She had to believe that this was the right path, for her and for her village. Ivera fluttered in front of Ebonheim. "What are you thinking about?" she asked curiously. Ebonheim gave the sprite a warm smile. "Nothing," she said, returning her gaze to the plains. "I'm just glad we've made progress." "So, what's the plan from here?" Ivera asked. Ebonheim gave a thoughtful frown before looking back at Ivera with a big smile on her face. "Wanna visit my village?" Ivera cocked her head to one side, her tiny eyes sparkling in curiosity. "Your village?" she asked. "Is there anything interesting there besides more humans?" Ebonheim laughed. "Of course there is. There are a lot of interesting things in my village. While we're there, you could also talk with our druids. I'm sure they'd love to meet you," she said with a wink. "Come on, let's go." All right," Ivera said, her wings fluttering as she flew beside Ebonheim. "I'll at least humor your wishes some more as thanks for all the work you've done saving Alindra." 16. Chapter 23, Ascendant Stage. The sun rose high over the village of Ebonheim, warming the rooftops of thatched houses and dabbling light across the interconnected dirt trails. A festive cheer filled the air, fueled by excitement and anticipation. The village, nestled in the heart of Elder Grove Forest, buzzed with activity, the villagers busy preparing for the grand festival in honor of their goddess. Ebonheim stood in the middle of the festive bustle. Around her, the villagers moved with purpose and efficiency. She smiled at their jubilant mood as she watched them work. A few glanced her way and offered smiles and respectful nods in greeting. She waved to them and continued her tour of the village. She wandered from one cluster of people to the next, stopping to offer words of encouragement or praise for a job well done. After a while, she decided to take a break and enjoy the peace and quiet. She settled down on a nearby bench and closed her eyes, listening to the sounds of the village at work. There was a pleasant breeze, rustling through the leaves above her. She smiled to herself as she leaned back against the bench and soaked up the sun's warmth. As she listened to the sounds of the village around her, her thoughts drifted to the upcoming festival. It had been a long time coming. The villagers had been waiting for this day for over a month now. Ever since she had mentioned to the elders that she was nearing her ascension to the next stage of divinity. She had been excited too, eager to see what awaited her on the other side. But now, as the day drew closer, her nerves began to get the better of her. She had no idea what to expect. There were so many things she didn't know about her role as goddess, and the Akashic system had been of little help in providing answers. A soft voice interrupted her thoughts. "You're lost in thought." A goddess. Engine Merrick, his eyes crinkling in mirth, approached her. He settled on the bench beside her and took a deep toke from his herb bundle. "What's on your mind?" Ebonheim grinned. "Just the festival," she replied, "and everything that comes after." Engine nodded sagely. "Ah, yes. I see," he said, his eyes twinkling with amusement. "So many preparations to be made, it's no wonder you're lost in thought." He chuckled to himself and blew a smoke ring at the sky. "Still, no reason to fret. This will be a good day for all." Ebonheim tilted her head, curiosity evident in her voice as she asked, "How do you know?" Engine shot her a look. "Because you're here." Ebonheim blushed and nodded, biting her lip to hide her smile. Engine's expression softened, and he patted her shoulder in a fatherly gesture. "Now, you're too serious. You need to relax." He stood up and offered her his hand. "Come on. Let's go for a walk." Ebonheim took his hand gratefully and followed him along the path as he chatted idly about the day's festivities and his plans for the village's future. She listened with half an ear as she marveled at how much he had come to care for the villagers in such a short time. She was like a child in her first years of life, eager to learn and experience everything that came her way. As they walked, they came upon a group of young boys and girls who had stopped to play. One boy held a stick. He was swinging it in slow arcs, moving back and forth as though he were trying to keep his balance on a horse. A girl sat to his right, watching him with a small smile on her face, while two more boys sat on his left. They laughed at his antics and gave him encouragement when he wavered off balance. Ebonheim couldn't help but laugh as well. She watched with a smile as the boy stumbled and fell, giggling as he got up again. They continued their walk, chatting idly about this and that until their conversation was interrupted by Hilda, her striking blue eyes twinkling in joy. "Oh, there you are, my dear," she crooned, moving towards them. She wrapped Ebonheim in her arms and hugged her close before turning to greet Engine. "Thank you for keeping our little goddess company." Engine grunted and ruffled Ebonheim's hair. "Well, Someone had to do something about her endless worries, he grumbled good-naturedly. Hilda shot him a pointed look. Engine rolled his eyes and shook his head in resignation, mouthing a silent prayer before turning back to Ebonheim. "We've finished the preparations for tonight's feast," he said, gesturing towards the village square. "There will be a bonfire and music. The entire village will gather to celebrate your ascension." Ebonheim smiled brightly, her golden eyes glittering with excitement as she gazed towards the feast hall in the distance. "It sounds lovely." Hilda nodded in agreement. "It is." She chuckled softly and nudged Engine with her shoulder. "Though we've had to make some last-minute adjustments." She paused and raised an eyebrow at Engine. He groaned and sighed heavily before turning to face Ebonheim. "There was an unfortunate incident that happened yesterday," he began, rubbing the back of his neck awkwardly. "One of the villagers forgot to lock his shed, and several pigs managed to escape into the forest. There was a bit of a panic, but everyone has been found." He cleared his throat and fixed his gaze on the ground. When he spoke again, his voice was strained with embarrassment. "There might be a few piglets around the village, nothing to worry about." "Of course. And who was this villager?" Hilda drawled, her tone light but her eyes sharp as she glared at Engine. "Do tell." "It was me," he muttered, avoiding both their gazes. Ebonheim stared at him with wide eyes for a moment before bursting into laughter. She held onto Hilda's arm for support as she gasped for breath and shook with giggles. "I can't believe you forgot to lock your shed," she wheezed, wiping tears from her eyes. Engine looked at her in mock outrage. "I was preoccupied," he muttered, crossing his arms defensively. Ebonheim giggled and poked him in the ribs, earning a startled yelp from him. He glowered at her as she ducked away and stuck out her tongue, laughing all the while. Hilda shook her head and smiled fondly at them both. "That's enough," she scolded playfully. "There are still more preparations to be made and I came over to ask for Ebonheim's help." She patted Ebonheim's shoulder gently before turning to leave. "If you'd be so kind," she called over her shoulder. "Of course," Ebonheim called after her. She turned back to Engine, her expression sheepish. "Sorry for laughing." Engine chuckled and waved off her apology. "It's fine." He pinched Ebonheim's nose between his fingers, his expression mock serious. "Now, off you go, there's still much to be done." Ebonheim grinned and swatted his hand away. "I will." She started to walk away, but turned back to face him one last time. "Thank you, Engine." She flashed him a brilliant smile and waved goodbye, then hurried off to Hilda's side. The next day, the vibrant energy of the festival resonated with the early morning chirping of birds and the rustle of leaves as the village stirred to life. Banners of silk and bunting adorned the thatched rooftops, fluttering in the gentle wind. Each one bore the symbol of their goddess, a delicate sprig of elder tree framed by a crescent moon, representing their hope. Their Ebonheim stalls brimming with fruits, nuts, and savory delicacies lined the village commons, their enticing aromas wafting through the air. At the heart of the festivities stood Ebonheim herself, radiating an aura of tranquility. Her iridescent hair caught the sunlight, shimmering like a kaleidoscope of colors, as she moved through the crowd, her gold eyes gleaming with joy. This was her first festival, and she was determined to make the most of it. The cobbled square filled with the sounds of laughter, the clang of goblets, the lilting notes of lutes, and the rhythmic pounding of dancing feet on the worn, earthen floor. Games of strength and wit, dancing circles, and stalls laden with food, all vied for Ebonheim's attention. A group of children pulled her towards the ring toss, their giggling faces lit up with excitement. She bent down, her white silken dress pooling around her, to listen to their quick-fire rules of the game, nodding and giggling along with them. "Aye, lass, ye best watch your aim," came Thorsten's booming voice, as he strode over, his armor discarded for the day, replaced by a sleeveless tunic and brown trousers. He held up a handcrafted wooden ring, grinning at Ebonheim teasingly. "This is a hard game." Ebonheim scoffed and snatched the ring from his hand. "Is that a challenge?" She raised an eyebrow at him in a dare. He shook his head in mock horror and backed away as she tossed the ring with a flick of her wrist. It landed squarely in the middle of the peg, and the children cheered. She straightened up, puffing her chest out in pride as Thorsten chuckled and handed her another ring to toss. They played until Thorsten conceded defeat, handing her the final ring with a resigned sigh. "You've bested me." He ruffled her hair fondly, his gruff features softening as he regarded her with a tender smile. "Good game." Ebonheim winked at Thorsten and beckoned the children over to come pick their prize. They surrounded her in a rush, each clamoring to choose first, their voices overlapping in a jumbled mess of squeals and shouts. Ebonheim laughed and relented, allowing them to pick their prizes from the display of wood and leather bracelets and rings. Thorsten stepped forward, a wry grin on his face, as the children ran off in a cloud of giggles and grins. "Good aim, lass." Ebonheim grinned at him and tucked a strand of her hair behind her ear. "You should know. You're always telling me to be more competitive." She cast him a sidelong glance. "Besides, I had to get my revenge for our spa." Thorsten shrugged unapologetically. Can't blame a man for wanting to see a goddess win at something. He crossed his arms over his broad chest, his eyes twinkling with mirth. "Where to now?" "To the wood chopping competition," Ebonheim said with a mischievous grin. She slipped her hand into the crook of Thorsten's elbow as she led him to the clearing where the competition would take place. This should be interesting. As they arrived, they found the crowd buzzing with excitement, and the contestants taking their places, 4 men, standing in a row with axes resting on the flat of their open hands. "Bjorn's gonna win, as always," Thorsten's voice boomed over the crowd, his face creased into a teasing smile. He patted Ebonheim's hand resting on his arm and chuckled as she rolled her eyes at him. "But who knows, the competition has been growing fierce recently." Bjorn looked over at them and waved, flashing them a winning smile. Ebonheim waved back, grinning widely. She took a deep breath and prepared to cheer. But Thorsten covered her mouth with his hand and shook his head. "Best not to jinx 'em," he murmured in her ear. She nodded in agreement, and the competitors set off at the signal to start. They swung their arms with practiced ease, axes thudded into logs as they circled around the log pile. The crowd erupted into cheers and roars as Bjorn swung his axe, the strike resounding through the clearing as wood chips flew. In 3 hefty blows, the log was split cleanly in 2, and the crowd went wild. Ebonheim laughed, her claps blending with the villagers. She squeezed Thorsten's arm affectionately, and he squeezed her hand in return. Bjorn grinned and accepted the congratulations and cheers from the crowd, laughing and waving to them all. Ebonheim cheered the loudest, jumping up and down as she shouted his name. When he turned to face her, his eyes gleamed with a playful glint. He inclined his head to her, and the crowd parted as he strode towards her, the two meeting in the middle with a firm clap on the back. Ebonheim grinned at him. "Nicely done." "What prize did you win?" she asked, gesturing to the collection of trinkets left over from Roderick's visit a while back. Bjorn grabbed a silver bracelet and dangled it in front of her. "This. My wife's been nagging me to get her a gift for a long while now." Ebonheim eyed the bracelet with mock concern. "Are you sure she'd like this one?" she asked, reaching out to touch the cool metal. "It doesn't seem fancy enough." Bjorn chuckled and shook his head. "Don't worry about that, she'll love it." "She'd better," Thorsten said on his approach, "because you're one mistake away getting tossed out of your house." Bjorn snorted and elbowed Thorsten in the ribs. "Not my fault she's picky." Thorsten threw his hands up in surrender and guffawed, the 3 of them falling into a fit of laughter. Ebonheim wiped the tears from her eyes, shaking her head at them with an exasperated smile as she tried to calm her breathing. The festivities continued throughout the day. After the wood chopping competition, the 3 of them joined the rest of the crowd in a wrestling tournament. After that, there was music and dancing. Ebonheim's feet ached from all the dancing she had done, but her cheeks hurt from smiling so much. She then turned her attention to a group of children, their laughter chiming through the noise. They were racing around the commons, little legs kicking up dust, cheeks flushed with excitement. Lyra was cheering them on, her gentle clapping accompanied by soft words of encouragement. When she noticed Ebonheim watching them, she beckoned her over. Ebonheim excused herself from her companions and rejoined Lyra at the edge of the race. "Congratulations on winning," Ebonheim said to the winner, a boy with bright blue eyes and dark blonde hair. He puffed out his chest with pride, beaming at her as she handed him a pouch full of sweets. "Here, this is for you." The boy grinned, his eyes sparkling as he tore into the bag, the others joining in with raucous laughter. "Thank you," he said, grinning widely as he darted away, the other children trailing after him. Ebonheim waved goodbye to them as they vanished into the crowd, then turned to face Lyra. "That was fun." Lyra nodded in agreement. "Indeed," she gestured to the children, her eyes twinkling with affectionate fondness. "They're so energetic, and always so full of life." Ebonheim nodded in agreement, then glanced at Lyra curiously. "Are you enjoying the festival?" Very much so, Lyra said with a smile. It's a wonderful celebration, one that we all deserved. She turned to face Ebonheim, her expression solemn as she bowed her head. Thank you, goddess, for blessing us with such joy. Ebonheim blinked and blushed, taken aback by Lyra's display of reverence. You're welcome. She reached out and rested her hand on top of Lyra's head. The young druid looked up at her in surprise, her expression tinged with awe. We all worked hard to make this day as special as possible. Lyra's smile was radiant as she touched the tips of her fingers to her forehead. That's very kind of you. I look forward to witnessing your divine ascension. She nodded, her expression solemn once more, and departed. Ebonheim watched her go, feeling oddly shy and flushed. She turned to join the elders on the feast hall porch. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky with strokes of scarlet and gold, the village was alive with chatter and laughter. A band of musicians had started playing a lively tune on their flutes and drums, their melodies weaving through the air, enticing people to tap their feet and swing their hips. Ebonheim found herself caught in the rhythm, her body swaying with the music. The aroma of roast meat and baked goods filled the air, as the villagers prepared for the grand feast. Ebonheim's mouth watered at the scent of spiced meats and sweet berries, the promise of a delightful meal making her stomach rumble. Bogdan, the quiet and steady presence in the council, approached Ebonheim, offering her a goblet filled with honeyed mead. To our goddess, he raised his own goblet in toast, a genuine smile on his face. The villagers followed suit, their voices ringing through the clearing. To Ebonheim, the cheer was heartfelt, a proclamation of their trust and faith. As she drained her goblet, feeling the sweet liquid warm her throat, she felt the weight of their eyes on her. Their smiles and cheers echoed in her ears as she searched their faces, drinking in their expressions of gratitude and affection. Pride swelled in her chest as she basked in the warmth of their devotion, the fervor of their adoration. She would give them anything, everything, if they only asked for it. You've acquired 2 quintessence from a villager's reverence. Quintessence, 7,998, greater than 8,000. Quintessence, 8,000 8,000ths. You have reached the required quintessence to increase your divine rank to lesser god, ascendant stage. The celebration continued, but a change started to take form, a stirring within Ebonheim. The quintessence she had been amassing felt restless, eager to surge and propel her towards her ascension. Sensing the shift, Hilda appeared at her side, a knowing look on her face as she nodded at Ebonheim. It's time, Hilda whispered, before tapping the end of her walking cane onto a flat stone on the ground. A resounding chime rang through the air, reverberating through the village square and all the way to the outskirts of the forest. The musicians fell silent and the crowd grew still, their eyes drawn to the sight of the elders and their goddess in the center of the commons. Would you like to ascend? Ebonheim stood with her eyes closed and hands clasped together, her expression serene as the villagers gathered around her, gazing up at her with expectant gaze. As she inhaled deeply, the quintessence responded to her summons, rushing towards her like a storm surge. Her eyes snapped open, her essence swelled, harmonizing with the accumulated quintessence, merging and morphing into a symphony of divine ascendance. A brilliant burst of divine energy erupted from Ebonheim, casting a radiant golden light that bathed the forest clearing. Her body levitated, caught in the throes of a power beyond mortal comprehension. Around her, a dazzling aurora erupted, painting the evening sky in hues of celestial blues and purples. It pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat, a cosmic dance that held the entire village spellbound. The force of her ascension pushed the crowd back, the villagers crying out in awe as they struggled to stay on their feet. Her dress of white silk fluttered as if caught in a tempest, the fabric rippling with the force of her divine power. Iridescent hair fanned out, strands of light dancing around her, as the surge of quintessence ignited the change. Her golden eyes shone bright as twin suns, the depth of her divinity echoed in her unwavering gaze. As the quintessence took hold, her physical form shimmered, caught between states. Her skin seemed to glow, the olive tone imbued with a divine sheen. Her silhouette wavered, then solidified, her slender figure clad in a pristine white dress. The gossamer fabric clung to her curves, billowing with the force of her quintessence-infused wind. Your divine rank has increased from lesser god, dawn stage to lesser god, ascendant stage. Your quintessence has reset to 0. Your next ascension will require you to accumulate 16,000 quintessence. You have 32 attribute points to allocate. Your health increases by 50% of your base health. Your essence increases by 50% of your base essence. You are now able to purchase divine abilities with the requisite requirement of Lesser God Ascendant stage. All of your current divine abilities increase by 1 rank. You have acquired divine ability, Divine Aura, rank I. The ability is automatically activated upon first acquisition. Divine ability, Divine Aura, rank I. Effect, manifests an aura around you. The aura acts as a barrier with 300 health, 25 arcane defense, 25 divine defense, 25 physical defense, 10 damage reduction. All. The aura imposes penalties to any hostile beings without a divine rank. -5 attack. All. -5 defense. All. -5% hit chance. -5% block chance. -5% dodge chance. All allies gain +5 attack. All. +5 defense. All. And +5% hit chance when within 50 meters of you. Duration, until destroyed or cancelled. Cost, 30 essence. Requirement, Lesser God, Ascendant stage. Restriction, if destroyed or cancelled, it cannot be activated again for 1 day. Ebonheim descended gently onto the sacred ground, the glow around her dimming to a soft aura. As her feet touched the soft bed of grass, she breathed deeply, filling her lungs with the scents and sounds of the village. A chorus of gasps and cries sounded around her as she opened her eyes. She tilted her head to the side, as if listening to the melody of the night. The silence that followed was as profound as the transformation itself. The villagers stared in awestruck silence at Ebonheim, her form emanating a gentle, divine radiance. Ebonheim looked on at the crowd, giving a tentative smile as she addressed the stunned onlookers. "Well, what do you think?" The silence broke with a mighty cheer, a thunderous roar of celebration as the villagers surged towards her. The crowd swallowed her in a sea of embraces and hugs, and Ebonheim laughed as she was passed from villager to villager. As the onslaught subsided, she spotted Engine and the other elders making their way to her. Her expression softened as she turned to them, smiling at each one. Engine, who was the first to reach her side, embraced her warmly. Well, that was quite the spectacle. His smile was genuine and sincere, his eyes twinkling with pride. He patted her shoulder gently, and she pressed her forehead against his in gesture of reverence before stepping away to give the others a chance to greet her. Hilda hugged her tightly, kissing her forehead as she whispered words of praise and congratulations in her ear. "The village and the forest are blessed by your divine grace," she said, her expression serene. "Your ascension brings us joy. We shall endeavor to live up to your expectations." Bogdan and Sven shook her hand, both grinning widely as they told her how happy they were for her. When she turned to Thorson, however, the man had his usual stoic expression on his face. Ebonheim bit her lip to hide a smile, noting his odd behavior, but remained silent as he regarded her. After a while, he finally nodded to her. "Don't see much change. Maybe just a tad taller, but you're still the same clumsy lass that fell over and spilled a bowl of soup on herself." He reached out and patted her head lightly, his touch surprisingly tender as he smiled at her. "But there's some improvement." Ebonheim smiled at him as he stepped away to make room for the others, her heart warmed by his words and mannerisms. The villagers returned to their celebration, and Ebonheim spent the rest of the night walking around the village, talking with them all. By the time she retired to her hut, she was exhausted but happy, the sound of music and laughter echoing in her mind as she started to drift off to sleep. Just before her sweet slumber, the Akashic system suddenly chimed a message that shocked her awake. "You have reached the required divine rank to participate at the celestial auction residing in the sanctum of the divine mandala. You are invited to attend the next celestial auction, which will occur in 25 days. 8 lesser gods and 3 intermediate gods have accepted the invitation to attend. Do you wish to accept the invitation?" 15. Chapter 24, Progress and Opportunity. Ebonheim woke up the next morning, refreshed and calm, her mind quiet and at peace. She prepared herself a breakfast of fruit and nuts and sat on her bed as she ate, her thoughts turning to the events of the day before. As she had expected, the villagers had been eager to celebrate her ascension. They had been so eager that she had barely slept from all the hugs and pats on her head. Her expression turned somber as she recalled the prompt that had popped up after her ascension. She had read the prompt so many times in the night that her eyes had grown sore from staring at the screen. Now that she had a moment to think, she was more curious than ever about its contents. What was this celestial auction that the Akashic system had mentioned? And why had she been invited? It had been clear that the other gods had been invited too. Were they there to trade as well? If so, what would they trade and how much would they sell for? As she finished her breakfast, Ebonheim stood up and began to pace, her mind whirling with thoughts and questions. As she paced, she realized that she had been so preoccupied with the auction that she had forgotten to check her status screen. She reached out with her mind to the Akashic system, calling forth a prompt that materialized in front of her. Name, Ebonheim. Divinity type, terrestrial god. Artificial. Divine rank, lesser god. Ascendant stage. Quintessence, 3016 thousandths. Health, 285 285. Essence, 285 285. Attributes, Intelligence 17, Perception 23, Resilience 21, Strength 12, Agility 26, Endurance 17, Charisma 28, Manipulation 10, Wits 14. Combat stats, Divine Attack 19, Divine Defense 22, Melee Physical Attack 19, Ranged Physical Attack 21, Physical Defense 21, Block 24, Evasion 24. Innate abilities, Manifestation, Rank 2, Demanifestation, Rank 2, Divine Sight, Rank 3, Domain Administration, Rank 2, Domain Knowledge, Rank 2. Active abilities, Ailment Cleansing Pulse, Rank 2, Vines of the Bramble King, Rank 2, Divine Cantrip, Element Resisting Aura, Fecundity of Creation, Pest Repelling Prana, Verdant Craftsmanship, Rank 2, Enchanted Essence Bolt, Rank 2, Forest's Call, Rank 2, Tempest of the Grove, Rank 2, Blazing Essence Bolt, Rank 2, Arboreal Stride, Rank 2, Path of the Earth and Passage, Rank 2, Divine Aura, Rank I. Passive bonuses, Forest Stride, plus 50% health, plus 50% essence. Skills, Athletics, Intermediate rank, Craft, Bow, Intermediate rank, Melee Proficiency, Sword, Intermediate rank, Ranged Proficiency, Bow, Intermediate rank, Stealth, Apprentice rank, Socialize, Intermediate rank, Survival, Intermediate rank, Investigation, Intermediate rank, Bureaucracy, Apprentice rank. Ebonheim crossed her arms over her chest as she read through the prompt, her gaze lingering on her attributes and skills. It was comforting to see her progress in some ways. She had already grown a lot in just 8 months, but at the same time, she had barely scratched the surface of what she could do. Another prompt materialized, distracting her from her train of thought. 32 attribute points need allocation. I almost forgot about this, she murmured aloud. She pursed her lips as she considered her options, wondering where to allocate her points. Considering that the average human had an attribute of 16 and a maximum potential of 32, her own stats didn't seem so impressive. Should she focus on increasing her physical stats to gain an advantage in combat? Should she keep her stats balanced so as to avoid having any weaknesses? She frowned. If she had to choose between physical and mental stats, she would go with mental stats because she needed to grow more powerful, both for her own sake and for the sake of the village. But she also didn't want to neglect the physical part of herself. After all, she wanted to be able to fight as well as Thorson, Bjorn, Lyra, and Hilda. In fact, she wanted to be even stronger so that they wouldn't even need to fight. Ebonheim sighed as she paced back and forth, chewing on her lower lip as she mulled over her options. Eventually, she stopped in her tracks and made up her mind. You've allocated 32 attribute points. Attributes, Intelligence 17, greater than 22, Perception 23, greater than 26, Resilience 21, greater than 24, Strength 12, greater than 16, Agility 26, greater than 32, Endurance 17, greater than 21, Charisma 28, greater than 32, Manipulation 10, Wits 14, greater than 16. Your combat stats have been adjusted accordingly. Combat stats, Divine Attack 19, greater than 23, Divine Defense 22, greater than 25, Melee Physical Attack 19, greater than 24, Ranged Physical Attack 21, greater than 29, physical defense 21, greater than 26, block 24, greater than 29, evasion 24, greater than 29, health 285, greater than 337, essence 285, greater than 345. Right, Ebonheim said to herself, satisfied with her choices. That should be enough. With that settled, she left her hut and went to the training grounds to practice her swordsmanship, humming cheerfully to herself as she strolled along the dirt path. She found the others sparring with each other as they had done since day one. She greeted them cheerfully as she entered the practice grounds. "Good morning," she called out, waving to them. They paused to wave back before resuming their spar. Thorson tossed his practice sword to the side and walked over to her. Ebonheim greeted him with a smile, then took a few steps back so she could watch their practice session. After a moment, Thorson called out to her. "Oi, lass, want to spar?" Ebonheim tilted her head. "Against you?" she asked dubiously, raising an eyebrow at him. "Wouldn't I lose?" Thorson gave her an exasperated look. "We've been over this before, lass, it's not whether or not ye'd lose." He frowned at her for a moment before his features softened into a warm smile. "Besides, I want to see how much stronger you got after your ascension." Ebonheim beamed at him and nodded. "Then yes, please." She found a makeshift sword and shield in the corner and picked them up, then stood facing him as he picked up his own sword and shield. They eyed each other warily for a moment before beginning to circle each other slowly, keeping their distance from the other's blades. As she circled him, Ebonheim kept her attention fixed on his every move, memorizing his stance, his breathing pattern, his footwork, anything that could give away his intention to attack. When they got close enough to each other that their swords crossed each other's path, they struck simultaneously, their blades meeting with a sharp clash. Ebonheim leapt back and retreated a few steps, raising her shield to protect her face from his heavy downward strike. As she recovered, she shifted her grip on her sword and brought it down on his shoulder before he could recover from his own strike. Thorson grunted, the force of the blow throwing him off balance. Ebonheim grinned in triumph as she lunged towards him to press her attack. Thorson recovered and sidestepped her swing, striking her in the ribs with the edge of his blade. Ebonheim stumbled back, but kept her feet firmly on the ground as she raised her shield to block the next blow. They continued their fight like that, exchanging blows and feints, their swords clashing against each other as they danced across the dirt. As they fought, Ebonheim was pleased to find that she was holding her own better than their first spar. She was still losing overall, but she had improved significantly. She had learned to block Thorson's attacks better, and even managed to parry a few of his strikes. As they fought, Thorson started to grin as he began to perceive a change in her fighting style. Instead of blocking every blow he made, she started to attack as well, taking advantage of the openings in his defense to try to get in a strike or two. Still, she had yet to land a decisive blow on him. Thorson brought his sword up and gestured to her with his shield. "All right, lass," he said with a grin. "That was a good round." He walked over to Ebonheim and patted her shoulder affectionately. Ebonheim leaned against him as she rested for a moment, panting heavily as she caught her breath. "You're getting better," he said with a laugh. "Must be all that practice." Ebonheim laughed and swatted his arm lightly as she caught her breath. "I just ascended and I can't even beat you in a fight yet," she protested, raising an eyebrow at him in mock outrage. "How embarrassing." Thorson chuckled and shrugged nonchalantly. "I don't know how gods progress in their power, but most of us take years to reach your level of skill in swordsmanship." He paused for a moment to adjust his grip on his sword and shield. "Besides, you didn't use any of your divine powers, so expecting to win against me with pure mortal skill is..." He trailed off with a chuckle and shook his head. "I'm afraid you have a long way to go." Ebonheim's shoulders slumped. "Fair enough. Maybe after my next ascension, I'll be able to beat you with just skill." She shot him a sidelong glance. "So, what now?" Thorson gave her a mischievous grin. "Well, if you're ready, we could go another round." "Only way to improve your skill is through repetition." Ebonheim rolled her eyes and let out an exaggerated groan, earning a bark of laughter from Thorson. They both laughed as they returned to the practice grounds to begin again. As she rested after the sparring session, Ebonheim contemplated her recent ascension as well as the upcoming celestial auction. In the last 8 months, she had learned so much, not only from the villagers, but also from the Akashic system, and she was eager to take part in the auction. Of course, she would also need to consider the risks. If other gods wanted to participate too, then there was a chance she might end up having to fight them for the items they wanted to buy, but she figured she would just have to make peace with the possibility. Then again, what items did she want to buy for herself? Would the auction even have the kind of items she wanted to buy? What kind of currency did they use? She sighed, annoyed with herself for getting so distracted by her thoughts. If she wasn't careful, she would be late to meet the elders at the feast hall for lunch. She cleaned up her practice equipment and put them in the corner of the grounds, then hurried to the feast hall as quickly as she could. When she arrived, she found everyone seated around the feast hall porch, and Bogdan was busy serving them plates of food. As she sat down next to Hilda, she was greeted by the delicious aroma of warm poultry, crispy fried potatoes, and fresh, green vegetables. "Good timing," Bogdan said with a smile as he set down a plate in front of her. Just in time for lunch. As Ebonheim thanked him and started eating, he settled in the chair beside her and rested his hands on his belly as he gazed at the village below with a smile. "It's such a nice day." Hilda nodded in agreement as she sipped her tea. "It is." She glanced at Ebonheim and inclined her head to her. "How are you?" Ebonheim shrugged and gave a small, sheepish smile. "I'm good, just got done training with Thorson." As she spoke, she cut up the chicken on her plate with her knife and fork. When she noticed the elders staring at her with expectant expressions, she stopped and looked up at them, giving them an amused smile. "I still couldn't win." Sven snorted and took another bite of his food. "Told you." Bogdan shot him a look, but said nothing, instead turning to Ebonheim. "Well, you're making good progress." He nodded at her as if to reassure himself, then continued in a cheerful voice. "Now, enough talk of fighting, let's enjoy our lunch." A few weeks passed in a blur. As usual, Ebonheim spent most of her days performing her daily quests and learning from the engine. After their morning lessons, she would join the villagers in their tasks, caring for the animals, doing laundry, cooking, tending to the crops, and so on. By the time she had finished all that, it was late in the evening. Most days, she would join the elders for dinner before returning to her hut to sleep. Her quintessence had steadily accumulated since her ascension, and the promise of the upcoming celestial auction loomed over her every waking thought. Today was no different. After spending all day on her assigned quests, Ebonheim returned to her hut to rest up for the day to come. The next celestial auction, which will occur in 23 hours. Ebonheim smiled as she read the prompt. Soon, she would be able to participate in the celestial auction. She couldn't wait to see what was available for trade and what would be sold. But more than that, the thought of meeting other deities excited her. She had only heard stories about them from Engin and Hilda, and she was eager to learn more. She wondered what they would be like, what kind of abilities would they have. Would they be friendly or hostile? How would they act around each other? She imagined herself in a large room filled with gods and goddesses, each one unique, their faces unfamiliar yet captivating. With that delightful thought in mind, she closed her eyes and drifted off to sleep. When the Akashic system chimed an alert, Ebonheim jerked awake. She groaned and rubbed her eyes with her palms, then opened them again as she blinked at the bright light in the room. As she struggled to get her bearings, she blinked at the prompt that had popped up in front of her. "The celestial auction begins in 15 hours. Right." Ebonheim nodded to herself as she sat up and yawned, stretching her limbs as she swung her legs over the side of her bed. "Not long now." She smiled to herself as she walked to the door of her hut and stepped out into the bright morning sun. This was going to be an exciting day, she just knew it. She spent the day performing her daily quests like usual, and then went to see Engin in his house after sundown. When she arrived, he was bent over a table covered in plants and tools. He looked up when she knocked on his door, giving her a welcoming smile. "Ebonheim." He beckoned her inside. "Come in." Ebonheim slipped through the doorway and closed the door behind her, then leaned against the wall to watch as Engin sorted through the plants on his table. As he picked up each plant to inspect its leaves and roots, he muttered under his breath as if talking to himself, then placed them back on the table one by one as he grunted in disapproval. Ebonheim gave him a puzzled look. "What are you doing?" Engin huffed and tapped his finger on the table in front of him. "I'm trying to decide what to grow this year," he said. He gave her a sheepish look. "Usually, I rely on Hilda's advice to help me decide on what to do with my time, but she's been away with Lyra lately." He sighed and ran a hand through his hair. looking pensive as he stared at the plants on his table. She has a good eye for these things. But anyways, what brought you over? Ebonheim explained to him about the celestial auction and how she was excited to participate in it. Engine's eyes lit up with interest as she spoke, and by the end of her explanation, he was eagerly nodding in agreement with her. Yes, that sounds like a grand opportunity. He stood up and started walking around the room, the way he did when he was in deep thought. You should definitely attend, especially with your prospects. As he walked, he gestured with his hands as he explained what he thought she should do. When you get there, you need to stand out. You need to make your presence known. You don't want to just blend in with the other gods and goddesses. He came to a halt, turned to face Ebonheim, and gave her a serious look. If you want to earn their respect and consideration, you have to stand out from the pack. She blinked at him for a moment before letting out a small chuckle. You sound like you're talking about a battle, she said dryly. Engine nodded in agreement, his expression still serious. Ebonheim arched an eyebrow at him, then burst out laughing, shaking her head as she covered her face with her hands. Okay. She wiped her eyes and smiled at him as he came to stand in front of her again. So how do I do that? Engine hummed thoughtfully as he stroked his beard. That is something I can't answer. He shook his head. You will need to figure that out for yourself. He smiled at her and gave her an encouraging pat on the shoulder. Just do what feels right. Ebonheim nodded slowly. Right. She flashed him a smile to show she had taken his advice to heart, then stood up. Okay, I should get going now. Thank you. As she made her way to the door, Engine called out to her, Ebonheim. When she turned around to face him again, he gave her a wink and said, good luck. Ebonheim smiled at him and ducked out the door. She waved goodbye to him as she made her way back to her hut for the night. Underneath the cerulean sky, Ebonheim stood in front of her hut and waited for the Akashic system to announce the time for the celestial auction to begin. The Akashic system shimmered in front of her, its glowing runes displaying a single phrase. The portal to the sanctum of the divine mandala is ready. Ebonheim stepped back and eyed the empty air in front of her hut. A swirling, shimmering gateway that looked like a watercolor painting in motion appeared before her. Its edges fuzzed as it rotated slowly in a circle, casting the air around it with a faint white glow. As she approached, the gate widened as if welcoming her through its threshold. The air shimmered with a spectral iridescence as Ebonheim stepped into the portal, the ether around her prickling her skin with ethereal static. With a final look towards her village and a small sigh, she stepped through the threshold and into the unknown. There was a moment of weightlessness, like being submerged in a timeless ocean, followed by a gentle thud as her feet found purchase on the ground once more. She had arrived. The sanctum of the divine mandala, the sanctuary of deities, unfolded before her in all its resplendent glory. Its atmosphere shimmered with an iridescent light, reflecting off the surreal architecture of the sanctum. A complex weave of floating islands, interspersed with shimmering waterfalls that fell into the infinity below, and above, structures of luminescent crystal stood proudly, resembling a city nested amongst the clouds. Pillars that shimmered with galaxies in perpetual motion ascended towards a ceiling that mirrored the night sky itself, complete with constellations that sparkled in patterns unknown to her. Around her, the air vibrated with a hum, a melodious sound that resonated through her like a tuning fork struck against glass. The air seemed to caress her skin as she stood on its precipice. Her breath caught in her throat as she struggled to take in all the sights before her. She had never been to a place so wondrous before. The only word she could think of to describe it was sacred. She found herself standing on a pathway of glowing quartz that curved along a winding path. As she stepped onto the path, it hummed beneath her feet as if welcoming her into its embrace. Its gentle thrum reverberated through her body, lulling her into a daze. Without realizing it, she began to stroll along the path, as if pulled along by a tide. As she did so, she noticed more pathways branching off in other directions. She could only guess what wonders awaited her down each one. Slowly, she began her journey down the pathway. She walked with purpose but without haste, taking in the sights of the sanctum with an unwavering gaze. As she did so, she found herself remembering Engine's words from earlier. You need to make your presence known. You don't want to just blend in with the other gods and goddesses. Be daring and bold. They will respect that. Right. She straightened up and stepped forward, keeping her gait as regal as possible as she strode down the path. Daring and bold. 16. Chapter 25, "Hello, fellow gods." As she approached the end of the pathway, she began to hear voices. When she stepped off the pathway and into a clearing, she found herself at the foot of an imposing staircase made of gleaming, smooth stone that spiraled upwards. In front of the staircase stood two figures, two deities who had not yet noticed her arrival. Their voices echoed throughout the atrium, sounding as though they had come from somewhere else. Ebonheim moved closer to them, stepping quietly and hiding behind pillars to listen to their conversation. "So there's no chance that this is just a ruse?" One of the deities spoke. Her voice was melodious and enchanting, like wind chimes singing in the breeze, and her form shimmered with a radiant blue light. "You're sure you haven't been tricked?" Ebonheim stared in awe at their otherworldly forms. The female deity reminded her of an exquisitely crafted string instrument. Her human-like form appeared to be carved from a singular piece of wood with graceful curves and delicate contours, and her face, while beautiful, seemed to lack facial features, save for two large shimmering eyes with irises shaped like a musical clef, a G clef for the right and a bass clef for the left. A filigree of strings intertwined her body, glistening with a vibrant azure hue and quivering with each movement, creating beautiful tones in harmony with her melodious voice. Her companion, an ethereal, translucent being with flowing silken robes of turquoise and aquamarine, tilted his crowned head to one side and gave her a placating smile. "Yes," he replied in a melodious voice. "I'm certain." As he spoke, his robes fluttered like wind-blown veils in time to the tune of his voice. A rippling aura of blue energy surrounded him like a soft halo that highlighted his translucent silhouette. He gestured with a slender hand and conjured an image of the celestial hierarchy above his head, a diagram of the gods at various ranks. To prove his point, no deception, no subterfuge. Everything has been in order. The female deity narrowed her eyes as she gazed at the diagram above her head. "Then it's true," she murmured. "We're really stuck in this cycle." As she stared at the diagram, her voice took on a bitter tone. "It's been over a decade since we've even had a chance at ascension." The male deity lowered his head to meet her gaze. His expression was sympathetic, but firm as he spoke to her with a voice full of resolve. "That doesn't change our duty to the mortals." He gave her a sidelong glance and let out a long, thoughtful breath before continuing. "We must ensure the integrity of the system, for their sake as well as for ours." The female deity scoffed, then turned away from him to gaze up at the staircase. Her eyes roamed over the shining quartz surface with a troubled expression. After a moment, she shook her head, then turned to face the translucent deity again, her voice soft and apologetic. "I'm sorry, you're right. Of course." As she spoke, she rested her hand on the translucent deity's shoulder, giving him a sympathetic smile. "It's just." She paused to gaze up at the ceiling. A cloudy haze obscured the constellations on its surface as she trailed off. After a moment, she shrugged as she turned her attention back to him again. "I suppose we have no choice but to wait." The male deity nodded in agreement. "As always," he replied with a solemn smile, his voice warm and comforting. They lapsed into silence after that. Ebonheim didn't want to interrupt their conversation by announcing her presence, so she waited a moment longer before clearing her throat to get their attention. The female deity turned to look at her as the translucent deity glanced in her direction. They exchanged confused glances as they regarded her for a moment before the female deity spoke. "Hello." She gave her a polite nod, her tone even and neutral. "Who might you be?" Ebonheim bowed deeply before the two deities as she introduced herself. "Well met." "I am Ebonheim," she replied with a cheerful smile as she straightened up again. "It is a pleasure to meet your acquaintance." Perfect execution. Those lessons of etiquette with Engine had paid off. Although she felt nervous talking to other deities for the first time, she had managed to speak politely and not stammer. As long as she remembered to maintain eye contact with them and speak clearly, she should be able to navigate any social situation. She made sure to keep her posture straight and her voice even and calm. That was another trick she had learned from Engine, how to portray a confident, welcoming demeanor despite being unsure or anxious on the inside. As Ebonheim spoke, the two deities exchanged puzzled glances again. She paused to study them for a moment before clearing her throat awkwardly. "Forgive me if I have interrupted something," she said as she inclined her head to them in a gesture of respect, then gave them a curious look. "What were you two discussing?" "Nothing important," replied the female deity. As she spoke, She gestured for Ebonheim to follow them up the staircase, then began walking towards it without waiting for her to follow. The translucent deity shrugged at Ebonheim and walked past her. They both followed the female deity up the staircase as she led the way. "You have come at a good time. We were just about to head to the auction." She tilted her head at Ebonheim with a small smile. "Are you here to bid on something as well?" Ebonheim shook her head as she matched their pace, walking a step behind them as she spoke. "I am here to observe," she replied with a smile. She had been worried about what to say when she approached them, but the words flowed naturally from her mouth as she spoke to them. "I have never been to one of these before." At that, the male deity turned to give her a puzzled look. "What do you mean? You've never been?" He paused and turned to give her a polite smile. "Ah, you must be new." As he spoke, he motioned for her to walk beside him. She did so without question and fell into step beside him. "Welcome then, to the sanctum of divine mandala." She returned his smile with one of her own. Even though he seemed a bit intimidating, his air was calm yet powerful. His voice was warm and soothing. As they continued walking up the staircase, she mused to herself how their forms were not dissimilar from her own. They had the same body structure as a human, and their faces were reminiscent of a human's, although theirs had very little features to speak of besides what resembled eyes and a mouth, if those were even considered features on a divine form. The female deity, on the other hand, was beautiful to behold. Even though she didn't appear to have any facial features, she radiated grace and poise, and Ebonheim couldn't help but wonder how such a deity could be so captivating. Even her voice was bewitching. The musical tone of her voice reminded her of the nightingales that lived in the forest near her village, and the notes she sang as she spoke made her feel as though she were in a trance. As the three of them reached the top of the staircase, they stepped onto a wide platform with an expansive view. In front of them was an intricate, gleaming mandala engraved on the floor, its inscriptions glowing with a soft blue light. Ebonheim gazed at the beautiful mosaic in awe. From this angle, the inscriptions almost seemed to be moving, as though the pattern had a life of its own. "Beautiful," she breathed as she marveled at its intricate design. "What do the inscriptions say?" "They tell a story," replied the female deity, her voice echoing across the empty chamber. As she spoke, the blue hue around her shifted to a faint teal. Ebonheim noted with amusement that the color change seemed to coincide with the deity's emotions. "A record detailing the fables of all divinity that has ever existed." The female deity shook her head. "Unfortunately, most of these stories are lost to time now." Ebonheim tilted her head at her as she studied her. The deity's face, as far as she could tell, was expressionless, but her voice revealed a note of sadness and longing. "Why is that?" As if sensing Ebonheim's curiosity, the male deity chimed in to speak to her. "When a god perishes, their fable ends." As he spoke, his eyes roamed across the vast chamber, pausing to stare at the stars on the ceiling above them. "Although no longer existing in the present, their fable is kept within the mandala itself, an eternal testament to the divinity they once were." As he spoke, his gaze drifted to the glowing inscriptions on the floor. His voice had a note of reverence to it as he continued. "They are inscribed here to ensure that their memory is preserved and their actions are not forgotten." They lapsed into silence after that. Ebonheim couldn't think of anything to say. There was so much to take in. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her thoughts only occupied with the stories and memories of divinity etched into the floor beneath her feet. When she snapped out of her reverie, she realized they had been standing here for quite some time. As she glanced at the two deities beside her, they seemed to be deep in thought as well. Ebonheim cleared her throat as she spoke, hoping to get their attention. "Are we going to start the auction soon?" The two deities glanced at each other, then looked at Ebonheim. After a moment, they nodded at her and began to walk towards the center of the chamber again. The male deity took the lead, gesturing for them to follow him. "Yes, let us head to the auction space." They walked through a wide doorway at the edge of the chamber. Ebonheim followed them through a hallway that was lined with intricate sculptures made of glass and crystal. As they passed each one, Ebonheim found herself gawking at their intricate details. Each sculpture seemed to tell a story of its own, and couldn't help but marvel at their craftsmanship and beauty. Eventually, they came to a stop at a large amphitheater surrounded by a hovering dome of translucent crystal. As they stepped into the arena, Ebonheim stopped to admire the view. Around them was an expansive view of the sanctum of divine mandala, including its various floating islands and glittering spires that floated within a nebulous expanse of swirling mist. The nebulous expanse shimmered with an ethereal glow as the stars sparkled in the distance. The air around them hummed with the same spectral static Ebonheim had felt earlier when she had first stepped onto the platform where the inscriptions had been displayed. There was a weightlessness to this place. The pressure of being here at all made her feel like she was floating. If she closed her eyes, she could almost imagine she was flying. The sensation was so vivid, she had to open them again to take in her surroundings once more. When she glanced at the two deities beside her, they had taken their seats and were gazing at her expectantly. They seemed to be waiting for her to do the same. With a start, Ebonheim realized they expected her to sit with them, so she quickly hurried to do so. As she sat down between them, she felt herself relax. There was something about this place that put her at ease. Maybe it was the vast openness around them, or the quiet hum of the air itself, or even the warmth she felt radiating from them as they sat there. Whatever it was, she didn't want to ruin the moment by speaking too soon. She wanted to enjoy this experience to its fullest. The male deity had already begun to speak. As she sat down, "It appears that I have neglected to introduce myself properly." He inclined his head at her, his voice soft as he spoke to her. "My name is Etheron, god of Silveria." As he introduced himself, his aura glowed an electric blue as though responding to the emotion he was feeling. Ebonheim wondered if most deities did that. The female deity's aura had been teal earlier. Maybe her own divine aura would change color, too, if she was upset or angry about something. The thought made her curious. Maybe she'd have to try and change her aura colors on purpose just so she could see what it was like. As she pondered this, she turned to the female deity. "May I know who you are?" The female deity turned to smile at her, her eyes twinkling as she replied, "My name is Ariastra." She bowed her head at her voice lilting as she spoke. "I watch over the city of Bylice." As she introduced herself, she gestured with a delicate hand. A melodious tune rang out in the air as she did so. "I'm intrigued to meet you." As they spoke, the amphitheater came to life with activity. Several more deities entered through the wide doorway, their voices echoing throughout the chamber as they conversed with each other. Ebonheim watched as they passed by. One deity looked like a towering statue of polished alabaster carved into an elegant humanoid shape, her gleaming form contrasting against the blue backdrop around them. Her countenance was sculpted into a stoic, expressionless face with two twinkling star-like eyes. Her irises and pupils were pure white and illuminated her face with a faint, luminous glow that made her appear to be glowing from within. There were small crystalline protrusions on her face, a delicate crown that glinted in the light, and her hands had long, slender fingers that moved with a fluid grace as she walked. Etheron greeted her with a polite nod, and the being smiled at him in turn as she settled into her seat across the aisle. Across from her slithered a god resembling a giant, lumbering worm with slick, dark cobalt skin and a translucent body that rippled with bioluminescent patterns. Its long body uncoiled in an elegant arc as its head came to rest on its body, then began to vibrate with a deep, rhythmic hum before coiling itself around its seat. It glanced at them briefly before returning its attention to the god who had sat down next to it. Another god that entered the amphitheater was composed entirely of a translucent crystal-like structure in the shape of a humanoid figure with 4 elongated arms. His eyes, devoid of irises, were pools of golden light that seemed to glow as they reflected the lights around them. He regarded Ebonheim with a silent stare as he settled into his seat, and she found herself feeling oddly scrutinized by him. A few more gods entered after that. Ebonheim watched them take their seats and began to study them as well, noting the differences between them and how they acted. Some sat close together while others chose to sit alone. The last god to arrive appeared to be made entirely of solid, unyielding stone, resembling a towering golem with glowing fissures forming a complex network of luminous veins. As he strode into the arena and took his seat, his granite-like body crunched and ground together like gravel as he sat down. Ebonheim tried to catch his gaze as he took his seat, but he didn't seem to notice her. His face was an expressionless mask as he stared straight ahead. The only thing she could make out on his granite visage were 2 glowing golden eyes that flickered with an eerie intensity. Even though he was sitting a few rows ahead of her, the power she felt emanating from him made her shudder. She could only hope he wasn't annoyed by her presence here. The amphitheater fell silent as everyone settled into their seats. Then, as one, All the deities turned their attention to center stage. Ebonheim followed their gaze and watched as ethereal bands of light shimmered to life in the air above the stage and formed into glowing words. The divine auction will now commence. 16 divine abilities and 5 artifacts will be offered. As the words dissipated, a platform of iridescent light emerged from the center of the stage. Hovering on top of the platform were 5 objects and 16 floating screens that flickered with divine light. Ebonheim blinked as she gazed at the display, then turned to Etheron. Are those? Etheron nodded in response. Indeed, those are the divine abilities. As he spoke, his aura glowed with the same electric blue hue as earlier. Ebonheim guessed he was excited about something. Those screens will provide further information about the abilities. As he finished speaking, he turned to Ebonheim again and winked at her. Now, let us see what is to come. 14. Chapter 26. The Divine Auction, Part 1. There was a pause as everyone settled into their seats. Ebonheim turned to glance at the other deities in the amphitheater, watching as they exchanged intrigued glances and muttered amongst themselves about which item to bid on. She listened for a moment, hoping to catch the topic of discussion, but couldn't quite make out what was being said. When she glanced at the 2 deities beside her, they had also turned to watch the proceedings with rapt attention. Suddenly, Ebonheim felt something wet drip onto her shoulder and turned to find a deity looming behind her. It had a shimmering, watery body in the shape of a long serpentine creature that flowed and undulated like the gentle currents of a flowing stream. There were tiny, iridescent fish-like entities that swam within its liquid form. They gave off a faint, ethereal glow that shone through the translucent membrane of its body as it moved. It had no legs and instead coiled around itself as it drifted through the air. The head of the serpentine deity was flat and elongated, with 2 swirling pools of shimmering water for eyes. When it tilted its head at Ebonheim, a spray of mist spilled from its eyes. Ebonheim watched as the mist settled on her shoulder, forming droplets on her skin. As it spoke, its watery voice echoed across the room, rippling and quavering with each movement. I did almost mistake thee for a mortal who had trespassed upon our divine convocation, it said in a tone of gentle reproof, then flicked its long tail as though swatting at an inconvenience. Yet thou art clearly divine. It blinked its swirling eyes and tilted its head at her again, with droplets falling from its gaze. Why dost thou take the form of mortals? A strange one. Ebonheim glanced at Etheron for help. The deity beside her had not yet moved to respond to the serpentine deity's question. Etheron turned to meet her gaze, then rubbed his chin thoughtfully as he studied her. I am curious as well. When I first saw you, I thought it strange that your form looked indistinguishable from a human's. He reached over to give her shoulder a gentle squeeze. A body of flesh is unusual, even among divinity. As he spoke, his eyes roamed across Ebonheim's face. The color of his aura seemed to brighten as he gazed at her. How curious. As Etheron continued to examine her, Ebonheim shifted uncomfortably under his scrutiny, then turned her attention back to the serpentine deity that had spoken to her. Its eyes twinkled with amusement as it watched her, the water within them shimmering and swirling like a slow-moving current. After a moment, it flicked its tail again and turned its gaze to Etheron. It has been a full moon since thou didst grace our auction. Its voice sounded slightly apologetic as it regarded Etheron. How fare things in thy dominion? Etheron shrugged, his gaze distant as he answered the serpent deity. Nothing new. As he spoke, his aura dimmed to a neutral hue. His expression was somber as he turned to the god again. The mortals have been causing some trouble. A band of thieves has been preying on travelers through my city. His tone was pensive as he continued, his gaze wandering to the sky above them. However, it will not last long. His voice was soft and solemn, yet full of resolve. They shall fall, and the mortals will learn to obey. There was silence for a moment after he had spoken. Ebonheim noticed a few of the other deities glancing in their direction, then turning their gazes back to the auction. The serpentine deity tilted its head at Etheron and flicked its long tail in amusement. Thy dedication to thy dominion is verily unmatched. Its gaze flicked to Ebonheim once again. Strange one, who bears the form of mortals, I greet thee. As it spoke to her, its eyes swirled with gentle waves. Ebonheim tried not to stare at the creatures within its liquid form as the deity continued to speak. My name is Nifri. I watch over the city of Azure Oasis. As it introduced itself, it waved its tail at her. Pray, What be thy divine name? Ebonheim gave Nefri a small smile in return. I am Ebonheim. She pondered for a moment on how to explain herself, then shrugged as she continued. I'm the goddess of a village called Ebonheim. Atheron and Ariastra turned their gaze towards her at once. Atheron's eyes widened as he studied her with renewed interest, and Ariastra emitted a discordant note from the strings within her body as she stared at her. Nefri's eyes widened with surprise as well. Before it had a chance to reply, another deity chimed in to speak to them. Before either of them could speak, Nefri let out an audible gasp as well. It was a low, gurgling sound like water rushing into a deep crevice. Thou hast persuaded thy worshippers to take up thy name as theirs? Its voice was filled with awe. When Ebonheim nodded, Nefri stared at her for a moment longer, then spoke again in a soft voice. How bold and envious. Rare indeed is such an accomplishment amongst us. What do you mean? Ebonheim asked. Nefri glanced at Atheron and Ariastra. Atheron seemed to understand and nodded at her to proceed, so it continued. Many a god hath tried to convince their worshippers to adopt their names as theirs, but alas, their efforts have oft been in vain. Nefri slithered closer to them. The creatures within its liquid form swam in slow-moving eddies as it spoke again. Mortals can be stubborn beings, their pride oft getting in the way of their true desires. Ebonheim noticed its liquid form making a puddle on the ground as it moved, but she decided to keep quiet about it. More importantly, she never realized how big of a deal it was for a deity to share the same name as their domain. It seemed so ordinary to her, she hadn't even considered how strange that was until now. Well, the circumstance around the name of my village is a bit unusual, Ebonheim explained with a sheepish grin. So, please pay it no mind. Nefri flicked its tail in response. The creatures within its liquid body glittered and shone in response to the movement. Indeed, a rarity of great measure. It coiled around itself once again and began to glide across the amphitheater towards another deity from across the aisle. Very well. We shall engage in discourse again at a more fitting time. As Ebonheim watched Nefri slither away, she turned to Atheron and Ariastra again. Both of them seemed to be lost in thought as they gazed at her with varying degrees of curiosity and wonder. What is it? She asked them. Nothing, replied Ariastra in a gentle, lilting voice. I am simply intrigued by your form. She shook her head and turned back to face the stage again. Atheron was more forthcoming with his answers than she expected. I find myself curious about you as well. As he spoke, his eyes roamed across her face and down her body again. That mortal form is fragile and unimpressive, yet you seem to be at home in it. Wen crossed his arms over his chest and leaned forward slightly as he continued to regard her. But when it comes to acquiring the human's devotion, that form is most advantageous. Ebonheim shifted uncomfortably as he studied her. She didn't like being the focus of so much attention at once and couldn't help but feel self-conscious now. Atheron continued to stare at her even as she shifted in her seat, so she tried to smile to make herself look more appealing to him. Engine had said it would be better to appear confident while talking to gods. But now she wished she had just stayed home instead. She needed to change the subject before he kept staring at her like this. So, how does the auction work? She asked. Atheron gave her an amused smile as he replied. You will see soon. As he spoke, he gestured to the screen hovering above the stage with his long finger. It will begin momentarily. Ebonheim blinked in response. She wanted to ask more, but the translucent deity's aura shifted to a deep green color. His aura was reacting to the energy he felt in the air, so she held her tongue and turned to watch the display. The lights on the platform flickered as the first divine ability shimmered into view. The inscriptions glowed a brilliant silver as the words scrolled across the screen. Name, Echoes of the Past. Effect, this power allows you to access the temporal imprints of any object or location within your domain. You can peer into the history of the object or place, viewing past events as though you were a spectator. When using this power, you witness the historical timeline of the chosen target as if viewing a recording. You have the ability to fast forward, rewind, and pause these historical scenes, but you cannot interact with or alter the events witnessed. This power may grant you access to lost knowledge and hidden truths, enabling you to better understand historical events and guide your domain more effectively. Range, touch, for objects, self, when used on a location. Target, single, an object or location. Duration. The viewing duration is up to your discretion, however, Each viewing session can last up to 1 hour. Cost, 32 essence. Requirement, Lesser God, Ascendant Stage. Atheron inclined his head towards her and said, "A fascinating ability. I imagine many will find it useful." As he spoke, his aura shimmered to a deep blue color. Ebonheim assumed that meant he was excited about something. Ebonheim was intrigued by the idea of this power. The ability to access and view historical events from the past sounded amazing. Maybe she could use this power to learn more about her domain's history, or understand what happened during certain times in history, or even see events from different perspectives. That would certainly be helpful. She didn't think she would ever use it for personal gain, though. She didn't like the idea of digging into people's private lives and learning about things they didn't want shared. "Is that power something you might like to bid on?" she asked as she turned to him. "Among other things," Atheron replied with a smile. "This is just the beginning. There will be many more to bid on." As he spoke, he leaned forward and placed his elbows on his knees. "Although, this is a fine choice to start us off." His eyes flicked towards the floating screens, then back to Ebonheim again. "We shall see how much interest is shown in the ability before the bidding begins." Ebonheim was curious about the other divine abilities being offered, so she looked down at the floating screens by the base of the platform. However, the details on the screens were illegible. After a moment, she turned to Atheron again and tilted her head as she spoke. "Why can't I read the details on the screens?" Atheron shrugged as he replied, "Because their mystery means that one can gamble on waiting for a chance that the next power on the bid will be greater than the last. It is a strategy some choose to use." As he spoke, his aura shifted to a dull green. His eyes focused on the main bidding screen atop the stage as he continued. "I do not engage in such strategies. They are unreliable, and I prefer to avoid the risk." As he spoke, his eyes never left the bidding screen and his voice took on a stern tone. "That is why, when I see something that intrigues me, I do not hesitate to place my bid on it, regardless of what the other gods might think." Ebonheim's eyes widened as she listened to his words. He seemed to be passionate about his bidding strategy. She had to admit that she was intrigued now. "How often do you win your items?" she asked. Atheron paused, then held up 5 slender fingers and wiggled them in the air. She nodded at him, impressed, then turned her gaze back at the bidding screen. Another message appeared below the divine abilities description. "The bidding for echoes of the past will begin. The initial bid will be 1,000 quintessence. The bidding will end in 1 hour. If no bid is presented within 15 minutes of the initial bid, the auction for echoes of the past will end and the next divine ability will be displayed." Ebonheim's eyes widened as she stared at the number on the screen. 1,000 quintessence? That was so much. What did the other deities have to offer for something so valuable? And 1,000 was just the start. The actual price would be even higher if they managed to win the auction. She glanced to her side and willed the Akashic system to show her the amount she accumulated since her ascension. Quintessence, 962 16,000ths. So much, but so little all at once. If the rest of the divine abilities and artifacts were even half as valuable as this one, she doubted she could afford any of them. Even though she didn't want to leave empty-handed, it looked like all she could do was watch, at least that would be educational. As the bidding began, Ebonheim studied the deities sitting in the amphitheater. The only deity to bid on this ability so far was Atheron. His aura remained a deep blue color as he made his bid for 1,400 quintessence. The current bid is 1,400 quintessence by Atheron. One of the other gods, the being with a translucent crystal-like structure, gazed at Atheron with a neutral expression on his face before adding another bid for 1,600 quintessence. Atheron tilted his head in response and gave him an amused smile before responding with 1,800. The crystalline deity narrowed his eyes at Atheron, then countered with an offer for 2,000 quintessence. As they battled, Ebonheim realized that she had been wrong about Atheron and his excitement. His aura was an intense orange color now. She glanced at him to get his attention and asked, "Why did you bid so high?" As she spoke, she tried to keep her tone neutral. She didn't want him to think she was judging him. "It's not worth that much, is it?" Atheron turned to her and replied in a matter-of-fact tone, "It is." He paused to gaze at the bids on the screen with a serious expression on his face before adding, "And I am not bidding high just to be competitive. I have a good reason for wanting this divine ability." As he spoke, His aura glowed to a fiery orange and then dimmed again. Ebonheim guessed that his mood was shifting again, even though she wasn't sure why. Although you have only been here for a short time, you should already know that each divine ability has its own worth, and it is rare for a particular ability to show up again in the next auction. Ebonheim crossed her arms and tilted her head to one side, giving Atheron a quizzical look. Something didn't seem right about all this. She glanced to her side once again and prodded the Akashic system in her mind to display an ability similar to what was presented at the auction. After a moment, an ability appeared in her mind. The same ability as the one displayed on the screen, with one major difference: divine ability. Echoes of the past will require 100 quintessence to acquire. Do you wish to acquire this ability? She blinked as she looked at the Akashic system again, then back at Atheron, who raised a slender hand and increased his bid to 2,100 quintessence. The main central screen revised the current bid. The current bid is 2,100 quintessence by Atheron. Ebonheim rubbed her eyes and stared at her own Akashic system screen. Its message still hovered in front of her view. Divine ability. Echoes of the past will require 100 quintessence to acquire. Do you wish to acquire this ability? What's going on? Couldn't they just get the ability like this instead of getting it through the auction? 13. Chapter 27. The Divine Auction, Part 2. The bidding for the Echoes of the Past ended with Atheron winning the bid for 3,000 quintessence. Ebonheim glanced at him. The god sat with a satisfied expression on his face, his aura glowing a brilliant yellow-orange. She couldn't help but think that Atheron had wanted this ability all along. Why else would he bid so much on it? The information screen for the divine ability drifted towards Atheron, flickered briefly before disassembling into shards of light that seeped into his translucent head. Ebonheim watched as his eyes fluttered, as though he were experiencing some sort of strange dream, then opened wide again as though he had just awakened. As the glow faded from his eyes, he turned to Ebonheim and gave her a triumphant smile. Ebonheim managed to give Atheron a weak smile in return. She wasn't sure she wanted to admit her confusion, but she wasn't sure she could hide it anymore. She waited for him to say something, but instead he turned back to watch the display again, so she finally broke the silence. Are the divine abilities listed in the auction special? Can't you just acquire the ability yourself by just tasking the Akashic system? Atheron turned his head and stared at her with a quizzical expression on his face. He blinked for a few moments, then tilted his head as he replied to her question. You must not have been properly instructed by the system upon your awakening. That, or you have not paid attention to its explanations at all. As he spoke, his aura dimmed to a dull gray color. His gaze wandered to the sky above them as he continued. Aside from the powers we are born with, the only way for us to acquire more is by bidding for them through the divine auction. One cannot simply ask the system to bestow upon you another ability. She shifted her gaze to the prompt hovering in her peripheral. Divine ability. Echoes of the past will require 100 quintessence to acquire. Do you wish to acquire this ability? Maybe later. She looked back at Atheron and met his gaze. So, do we just accumulate quintessence each year just to spend them here to get stronger? Atheron nodded as he replied, that is correct. It would do well for you to understand that acquiring abilities is more paramount than hoarding your quintessence to ascend to the next divine rank. While doing so increases your overall power. If you lack the ability to utilize what you have, then you will be left with fewer options when dealing with outside threats to your domain, or attempts to it. That made sense. So then why was she able to acquire new abilities on her own without having to participate in the auction? Were her powers the exception to this rule? Ebonheim pondered about that for a moment, but her thoughts were interrupted by a chime from the central screen as it listed another divine ability on display. This one had an initial bid of 600 quintessence. Ebonheim remained silent and watched the other deities bid on this ability. None of them seemed to be interested in acquiring this one at first, but after a half hour, several more bids emerged at once, increasing the total price to 1,150 quintessence before finally being acquired by the deity with the form of a gigantic worm. The auction continued for hours on end. Some abilities were left without a bid, remaining unclaimed. Throughout the event, Ebonheim kept glancing at the Akashic system visible only to her. and watched as it also displayed the abilities listed on the auction screen. Just like before, each one could be acquired just by spending a fraction of what the other gods had spent in the auction to acquire them. She furrowed her brow as she pondered over this strange phenomenon. Why was she even allowed to acquire them like this? The time for the artifacts came, and the bid started slow. This time, the information presented for the items was minimal and vague. Crown of Celestial Vision. A radiant crown that grants the god wearing it the ability to perceive the subtle shifts of quintessence in their domain, providing insights into the state of worship and devotion among their followers. The initial bid would be 400 quintessence. The bidding will end in 1 hour. If no bid is presented within 15 minutes of the initial bid, the auction for Crown of Celestial Vision will end and the next divine artifact will be displayed. Oh, that seemed like a really useful item. Ebonheim would have been interested but doubted she'd win with her measly 962 quintessence. However, she watched as several bids emerged from across the amphitheater, until eventually being won by the goddess that resembled polished alabaster for 850 quintessence. The next artifact was up for bid, Cloak of Illusions, a shimmering cloak that allows the god to project illusions, making them appear as anything they desire. This is particularly useful for gods who wish to interact directly with their followers while hiding their divine identity. That one was won by the god that resembled a towering golem. Harp of Harmony. This divine harp can inspire peace and tranquility when played, soothing conflicts within a god's domain and fostering unity among their followers. Ebonheim had a hunch that Ariastra, the goddess, would want to get it, and she was right. In the end, Ebonheim didn't manage to win any of the artifacts on display, despite her curiosity about each one. While she did learn some valuable information about the auction, she ended up just watching the event unfold, unable to participate in the proceedings. Atheron had managed to acquire 2 more divine abilities. As for Ariastra, she ended up only acquiring the harp. When the auction ended, Atheron turned to Ebonheim with an eager expression on his face and asked her, "So, how did you find the auction?" Ebonheim pondered over his question for a moment before answering. "It was interesting." After a few moments, she added with a sheepish grin, "I should save up on more quintessence for next time." "Oh, when will the next auction be?" Atheron stood up from his seat and stretched. As he did so, his glass-like structure rippled and shifted like liquid metal, sending sparkling shimmers across his form. "Next year. There will be another auction 1 year from now. If you've saved enough quintessence by then perhaps you will get a chance to win what you desire. However, your invitation is not always guaranteed. The higher your divine rank, the less likely that you would be regularly invited. It is one way to ensure that gods of higher divine rank do not monopolize all of the boon presented here." 1 year. A lot could happen in that time frame. Ebonheim pondered over how she could gather more quintessence, but before she could think about it more, the other deities stood and began to move towards the exit of the amphitheater. Ebonheim turned to Atheron and asked, "Where are they going?" Atheron looked back at her and answered in a matter-of-fact tone, "Most likely back to their respective domains. We are given 4 days after the auction ends to mingle and converse with one another should we choose to. Afterward, we are forcibly ejected from the sanctum." Ebonheim blinked in response, then tilted her head to one side. "Wait, why?" Atheron shrugged and said, "Aside from attending the auction, many use this time to build alliances or form new partnerships. It is not unusual for them to share information regarding their domains." He paused for a moment, then continued, "However, I find it bothersome. Some tend to be brusque in their dealings with one another, often leading to conflicts. You seem to get along well with some of them, like Ariastra and Nefri," Ebonheim said. He raised a slender hand and rested his chin on it as he replied in a calm tone. "Indeed." He paused for a moment before adding, "Some are more challenging to deal with, though." As he spoke, his aura shifted to a light purple hue. He seemed to be thinking about something again. "Although, I do find that Ariastra has a calm demeanor when compared to some other deities, and Nefri is surprisingly knowledgeable." His gaze wandered back to Ebonheim again. "If you ever wished to have a conversation with any of us in the future, we would not mind if you joined us." Ebonheim nodded and smiled at Atheron. But before she could respond, he raised a slender hand and floated up into the air. As he did so, His body slowly transformed into a shimmering orb of light, then began to move towards the exit with a blurry trail of light behind him. Ebonheim turned to Ariastra and spoke to her as she stood up from her seat. "Will you be going too?" she asked. Ariastra shook her head. "I wish to stay for a bit longer. I am curious about your mortal form." As she spoke, her strings swayed gently in the air around her. "Would you like to accompany me while we converse?" Ebonheim nodded, then followed Ariastra's movements as she drifted across the aisle and moved towards the exit with her. Ariastra led her through the hallways, away from the grand entrance of the amphitheater and towards a small, secluded corner of the complex. As they walked together, they passed several deities coming and going. Most seemed to ignore Ariastra's presence and remained focused on their own conversations. Ariastra came to a stop at a small room where a pool of glowing water was formed within a luminous basin. "I find it fascinating," Ariastra said with a gentle voice as she turned to Ebonheim. "I've only met a few others whose forms were nearly identical to that of a mortal, but never one that matched so precisely." Ebonheim shifted her eyes to the water and smiled. "Well, it just sort of happened that I look the way I am. Aside from being teased for my height by a few of my friends, I really enjoy being like this." As she spoke, she brought her hand closer to the water and ran her fingers over its surface. It felt smooth and cool against her skin, yet there was also a tingling sensation that crawled across her palm, like tiny prickling needles. "I can't imagine being any different." Ariastra tilted her head to one side. "What do you mean by being teased?" Ebonheim brought her hand back and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear as she replied, "You know, about my height, and things like that." When Ariastra continued to stare at her, Ebonheim explained further, "Well, people seem to tease me about being small. They say I look cute or childish." As she spoke, she turned away to hide the blush she could feel warming her cheeks. "But I don't mind it, I know people mean well." Ariastra nodded at Ebonheim's reply, but remained silent for a few moments before saying, "How often do you interact with the mortals within your domain?" Ebonheim brought her knees to her chest and hugged them as she replied, "Every day. If I'm not sleeping, I'm usually out and about. And if not, I spend my time in my hut." Ariastra's eyes widened as she listened to Ebonheim's answer. "You interact with them frequently?" As she spoke, her strings shifted with a gentle melody as though in response to her surprise. Ebonheim nodded, then closed her eyes and settled back into the seat. She rested her chin on her knees as she replied, "Oh, yes. I spend most of my time with the villagers. Is that surprising?" Ariastra continued to stare at her in silence for a few moments before giving her a slow nod. "Yes," she replied at last. "It is surprising." As she spoke, her strings shifted to a quiet rhythm. "Most of us do not interact with our subjects unless there is a need to do so. Those that do tend to not last long." Ebonheim gave Ariastra a puzzled look. Her tone sounded odd, like she was telling her something she shouldn't be telling anyone else. "What do you mean by that?" Ariastra narrowed her eyes as she replied, "There were several deities in the past who have tried to get close to their subjects only to be betrayed by them. In the end, they either lost their domain or were driven mad." Her strings swayed gently, shifting to a somber tune. "It has happened time and time again. Most deities will eventually figure this out, but there are always some who are not mindful enough." That did sound alarming, but Ebonheim couldn't imagine the villagers ever turning against her. They were kind and gentle people, and they cared for her as much as she did for them. "Oh," Ebonheim said as she leaned forward and placed her palms on the water's surface again. "Well, I doubt that would ever happen." As she spoke, she ran her fingers through the water's surface again, creating ripples in its otherwise calm surface. "I love my people, they're my family." Ariastra watched Ebonheim play with the water for a few moments before continuing to speak. "For the sake of a young one such as yourself, I advise you to be more mindful. It is best not to draw too much attention to yourself, lest you find yourself in an undesirable situation." As she spoke, she shifted her gaze to Ebonheim's face. Her eyes seemed to be pleading with her, as though she was warning her, "Take care to maintain a low profile while you interact with your followers." Ebonheim brought her hand away from the water's surface and studied Ariastra's expression. Something about her seemed different to what she had seen before, but Ebonheim couldn't place her finger on what it was. "Why do you say that?" Ebonheim asked as she placed a hand on her chin in thought. "If I'm careful, I'm sure that nothing bad will happen. Ariastra shook her head and said, that may not be the case. While I do not doubt your good intentions, mortals are not always so innocent. As she spoke, she glanced back at Ebonheim, her eyes twinkling like two stars. Just be aware. As they continued their conversation, Ebonheim learned about Ariastra's home. Her domain, the city of Pylius, was a peaceful city, known for its grand music and culture. Ariastra was a patron deity that promoted art and music among its citizens. It was also a popular destination among travelers and the merchants on their way to other cities. Ebonheim found her company pleasant. Ariastra was kind and thoughtful. She was curious about many of the things Ebonheim did and asked about them often. They spent the next day exchanging stories about their lives in their respective domains and spent their time chatting about many topics, ranging from the mundane to the mysterious. At the end of their time together, Ariastra asked Ebonheim to accompany her to Pylius next year. Ebonheim had no problem agreeing. The time she had spent with Ariastra was interesting, and she wanted to learn more about her domain and her people. As she watched Ariastra depart, she couldn't help but wonder why Ariastra had been so wary about her interactions with mortals before. Ebonheim was sure that Ariastra just meant that humans can sometimes be tricky. But the more she pondered about it, the more she began to suspect that she had a different reason for being so concerned. After all, why else would she warn her about interacting with her people? 14. Chapter 28, Encounter with the Beastkin. The huntsmen of Ebonheim always felt a sense of awe whenever they ventured out through the forests of the Eldergrove Valley. Leaves rustled overhead, the dappled sunlight casting a kaleidoscope of hues onto the dense foliage. The tall ancient trees appeared as sentinel guardians, their gnarled roots sinking deep into the rich earth, while squirrels scurried about, their tiny claws scraping against rough bark. The scent of pine filled the air, mingling with the musky aroma of the forest floor. Bedecked in simple leathers and carrying handcrafted bows and quivers filled with arrows, 3 huntsmen made their way through the forest. These were men who knew their path and moved with an intimate familiarity. Elric was their leader, a man in his late 30s, burly and broad-shouldered, with a weather-beaten face that bore the evidence of a life spent outdoors. His eyes were keen, his movements precise. The silence he maintained was not one of austerity but born from the focus of a seasoned hunter. Then there was Orin, a younger man with shaggy brown hair and bright green eyes that sparkled with mirth. His frame was wiry but sinewy, showing strength of a different kind. He had a quick wit and a sharp tongue that often lightened the mood during their ventures into the forest. Lastly, there was Eddard, the elder of the group. His silver hair and beard were a stark contrast to the others. Despite his advanced age, Eddard possessed a strength and stamina that rivaled men half his age. He was a stoic figure, rarely speaking unless he deemed it necessary. "Look there," Elric whispered, pointing towards a thicket. "Deer tracks." "Right. Let's see if we can catch a big one today," Orin said, grinning widely. The trio moved silently, following the tracks, the thrill of the hunt, the subtle harmony of nature all around them. It was moments like these that reminded them why they loved their roles in the village. Their serenity was disrupted when a low growl echoed through the forest. They exchanged nervous glances, unable to immediately recognize the unfamiliar sound. "Be on your guard," Elric whispered, his grip tightening on his bow. They moved cautiously, their eyes scanning the dense undergrowth. Suddenly, a figure emerged from the shadows, a silhouette that bore the frame of a human, but was far more imposing. A wild mane of black hair framed a face that looked carved from stone. The figure stood at a distance, eyes gleaming with an intensity that sent chills down the huntsmen's spines. It was not just one figure, but several that appeared, their bodies adorned with tribal tattoos, their eyes wild and feral. Orin swallowed hard, his throat dry as he stuttered. Who are they?" "I have no idea," Elric replied, his voice steady despite the uncertainty. "But we'll soon find out." The forest held its breath, the usual chatter of woodland creatures replaced with an unnerving silence. Elric, Orin, and Eddard stood frozen, their eyes wide as they took in the sight of the figures emerging from the forest's depths. "Beastkin," Eddard murmured, his voice barely above a whisper. His seasoned eyes had seen many things in his lifetime, but the sight of them, in their fierce yet regal forms, brought a chill of trepidation he hadn't felt in a long while. Elric's eyes narrowed, his mind racing with the tales he had heard about these half-human, half-beast beings. Oren's eyes were wide with fascination and fear, a strange combination that had him rooted to the spot. A lone figure distinguished herself from the others. Taller than her kin, she held herself with an animalistic grace. Crimson tresses spilled over her shoulders like a lion's mane rippling in the forest breeze. Her eyes, ruby red and fierce, sparkled with an inner fire that eclipsed the others, and remained steadfastly locked onto their small group. High cheekbones sculpted her face, accented by a chiseled jawline. Her beauty was wild, raw, a stunning tableau of savage grace and deadly allure. Intricate tattoos wound their way over her muscular form, trailing the curves of her body. Her tail swished rhythmically in the air, brushing against the rustling leaves as she prowled closer. The intensity of her presence cut through the forest hum, a palpable, commanding aura that silently marked her as the undisputed leader. She, along with their kinsmen, was garbed in tribal garments of earthen hues, animal furs, loincloths, and feather capes. The garments covered them modestly, yet failed to conceal their proud figures. Their clothing bore signs of wear and tear, each item tattered and torn. They looked as though they had spent years roaming the wilderness, forsaking civilization and its trappings for a simpler life. Elric instinctively stepped forward, positioning himself between the beastkin and his companions. He raised his bow slightly, not aiming an arrow but showing that he was prepared to defend his fellow huntsmen. His voice echoed through the forest, steady but loud. "Who are you? What do you want?" Suddenly, the leader broke into a run, her movements graceful, her speed astonishing. Elric barely had time to react. In less than a breath, she was standing in front of him, her presence so overwhelming that he stumbled back and fell on his backside, his bow flying out of his grip. She did not attack, did not roar. Instead, she spoke. Her voice was smooth, a stark contrast to her appearance. "Hello, human. You seem lost." The other beastkin followed suit, surrounding the huntsman. Their eyes gleamed with amusement, their smiles displaying a row of sharp teeth. The huntsmen were well and truly caught, and they had no idea what was about to unfold. The lioness beastkin, her ruby eyes simmering with untamed vitality, squatted to match Elric's gaze. She spoke with a soothing purr, her tone so casual it was as if they had encountered each other during a routine morning stroll, rather than in the confines of an ambush. "Lost, or perhaps trespassing?" "We're hunters," Elric responded, striving to keep his voice steady. "From Ebonheim." The lioness tilted her head and studied him with a quizzical expression. Her eyes narrowed and focused on his face. "Ebonheim, you say? Is that the name of your tribe?" As she spoke, her hand inched closer to him, her claws almost grazing his neck. Elric suppressed a shudder, and said, "Why yes, it's the name of our village." She brought a slender finger to his chin and lifted his face. As she did so, she leaned in closer. Elric could smell the aroma of the forest on her, earthy and damp. "Then, what is your name?" Elric swallowed hard, trying to focus on the question instead of the closeness of this half-beast. "Elric," he stammered. "My name is Elric." "A name as sturdy as oak." "Elric," she said, rolling the syllables around her mouth as if tasting them. At that moment, one of the other beastkin tapped the lioness' shoulder. Elric noticed that her irises changed color, from the deepest crimson to a lighter shade. When she spoke again, her voice held a hint of annoyance. "I do not require your help, Ro." As she said this, her eyes flickered to her companion and narrowed. Ro nodded at her with a smile on his face before taking a step back to join his kin. When Elric turned his attention back to her, she had stood up again and was staring down at him. "We mean no harm," Elric began, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. "We're just looking for game." They regarded him silently for a moment. Then, to his surprise, she threw back her head and laughed. It was a rich, infectious laughter that echoed through the trees and caused the birds to scatter from the branches. She brushed back her mane of fiery red hair and looked at Elric with a mischievous glint in her eyes. "Oh, how thrilling!" she exclaimed, her voice rich and velvety. "Hunters, are you? And what might you be hunting in our woods?" There was an undertone of amusement in her voice, and Elric could only look at her, dumbfounded. Her presence was larger than life and, despite the fear gnawing at him, he found himself enthralled by the creature in front of him. "Deer, mostly," Orin chimed in, his voice a little higher than usual. "Deer, mostly," she mimicked Orin, looking at him with amusement dancing in her eyes. The others chuckled, causing the huntsman to shift uncomfortably. "Well, hunters, it seems we have a problem," she continued, her amusement fading to be replaced by a steely gaze. "You see, we've been hunting in these lands too, and game has been scarce." "What are you saying?" Elric asked, trying to keep his voice even despite the panic rising in his chest. "I doubt your claim in this territory," Eddard interrupted, his voice leveled despite his words. "We've hunted through this region for over a year and we've not encountered your kind before." Elric noted a tinge of defiance in Eddard's words. Although his response was true, it probably wouldn't bode well to provoke them. A fierce grin spread across the lioness' face. The hint of amusement was back in her eyes. "We just got here, old wolf," she purred. "This is our first hunt in this area, but I don't see how you can stop us from claiming this territory as our own." As she spoke, her tail brushed against Elric's legs, causing him to flinch away instinctively. Orin slapped Eddard's arm lightly and hissed, "What are you doing, old man? Don't provoke them. They'll kill and eat us." Elric narrowed his eyes as he studied the lioness' face. He wasn't sure if she was serious or toying with them. "Maybe we can work something out," he said, drawing her attention again. "We could trade you something valuable to your tribe." A murmur of discontent swept through the beastkin at Elric's words, causing him to panic slightly. However, he soldiered on, despite his rising fear. "I can't speak for all of us," he continued, "but I can speak for myself." As he said this, he reached behind him and rummaged through his leather pouch. "I can give you this," he offered as he placed a small glass bottle filled with a purple liquid in front of her. She studied it intently for a moment before shrugging. "What's so special about this?" she asked as she picked it up and examined it. Elric said nothing for a moment. His gaze darted from the bottle to her face to her companion's. Then, as he collected his thoughts, he said, "It's a tonic for minor illnesses." At this, the beastkin around her began to murmur again. Elric dared not speak further until they had quieted down, but when they did, he continued, "It can cure colds, fevers, even common illnesses like coughs and sore throats." The lioness regarded the glass bottle with a cocked head before turning back to him. "What does this get you in return?" she asked. "A bit of space for our hunts," Elric said. "We can hunt elsewhere in the forest for the rest of the year." There was silence as she pondered Elric's offer. After a while, she nodded slowly, then held out her hand for him to shake. "Deal," she purred, her smile sharp like a blade. "I will take this potion and let you and your companions pass in peace." As she spoke, she regarded him with those crimson eyes, her gaze burning like fire. Elric stood in silence for a moment before shaking her hand. His instincts told him that if he did not, his death would follow soon after. "Agreed," he said, and bowed his head slightly in gratitude. Rose stepped forward again, tapping the lioness' shoulder. Once again, the lioness tilted her head slightly and said, "Yes?" Rose hesitated for a moment before moving closer to whisper into her ear. Elric watched as she frowned and narrowed her eyes at Rose before glancing back at him. A slow smile spread across her lips, and she turned back to him, her voice once again laced with amusement. "Before we let you go, Hunter," she said, "we need some information." She moved back to her group, her fingers dancing along the intricate tattoos that adorned her muscular form. Elric watched her, a mixture of fear and curiosity welling within him. He had the unnerving feeling that their lives had just taken an unexpected turn. "Information? About what?" Elric asked, his brows knitting together in confusion as he looked at the fiery-haired beastkin woman. "Your village. We need to know about its defenses, its resources," she responded. Her voice was firm, and there was a calculated look in her ruby-red eyes that made Elric tense. "Why?" Eddard demanded. "Are you planning something?" Orin bit Eddard's arm again to silence him. He shot his old friend a reproachful glance. After a moment of silence, the lioness answered, "Just curious." Elric frowned, but didn't say anything. He knew nothing about these half-beasts and their motives, but he couldn't help but feel wary of their intentions. Still, they had struck a deal with them. The least he could do was trust their word. Maybe they just wanted to get to know Ebonheim a little better? The lioness studied the huntsman in silence for a moment before speaking again. "Well, what would you do with that information?" Elric countered warily. "Haven't decided yet," she answered casually, grinning at Elric's grim expression. From her side, a slightly smaller, but no less intimidating beastkin with sleek black fur covering his arms stepped forward. "Better cooperate, human," he warned. his voice gravelly and his fangs gleaming menacingly in the sunlight. Caught between the threatening visage of the black-furred one and the enchanting, yet equally intimidating woman, Elric looked back towards his fellow huntsman. Oren gave a slight shrug while Eddard folded his arms, his expression stern and impassive. "And if we refuse?" Eddard asked, his gaze flitting from the black-furred one to the lioness. In answer, the woman chuckled again. Her laughter echoed through the trees, and a few small animals scattered, spooked by the sound. "Well, I would hope it doesn't come to that, old wolf. It would be rather unpleasant." Eddard, Oren hissed, shooting the old man a glare. "Maybe we should just cooperate." Eddard said nothing in return. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly and fixed his gaze on the lioness again. Ignoring their bickering, the woman turned to the rest of her group, giving them an expressive look. A few of the beastkin broke off, circling the huntsman with an almost playful ease that belied their deadly intent. Elric considered this for a moment before sighing deeply. "Fine," he said. "We'll tell you." As he spoke, he looked back at the lioness, his eyes boring into hers. "Will that be sufficient?" She grinned at him and nodded. "Yes." "Tell me about Ebonheim, your village. How many warriors do you have? What kind of food are you hoarding?" He coughed, trying to keep his composure. "We aren't hoarding food. We're simple people. We hunt, we gather. As for warriors, we have enough to protect our own." The lioness cocked her head, an eyebrow quirking up as if she'd heard a particularly amusing joke. "Enough, huh? You must consider the measure of your enemies before you can claim to have enough warriors." A ripple of laughter rolled through her companions, the sound dissonant amidst the tense atmosphere. Oren stiffened, his grip tightening on his spear, but Elric held up a hand, silently urging him to stand down. "We have enough," he repeated firmly. "Besides," he added with a half-smile, "we do have a goddess watching over us." As the tension built up, a sudden, incongruous rumbling broke through. Oren blushed, his hand on his stomach. "Sorry. Haven't eaten all day." Another ripple of laughter washed over them, the leader shaking her head, her chuckles filling the air. "You're funny," the lioness purred. "Why would a god care about a little village like yours?" Elric opened his mouth to respond, but before he could say anything, one of the beastkin behind the lioness clapped her hand on the woman's shoulder and said something in a low growl that Elric couldn't make out. Suddenly, the lioness turned away from him and walked a few steps to join her companions. Her gaze wandered over them, taking in the hushed chatter they exchanged before returning to Elric. "Stop spouting nonsense about having a god as your protector. Just tell us more about your village," she said, her eyes narrowing slightly as she met Elric's gaze again. "Speak, hunter." As twilight draped itself over the forest, the interrogation carried on. The lioness beastkin, her eyes glowing like smoldering embers in the dwindling light, prodded the captive huntsman with questions that seemed deceptively benign. Yet, with every passing minute, Elric and his companions found themselves reluctantly unraveling the secrets of their village. "And the food?" she asked, leaning back against a tree, the sinuous grace of her movement unmistakably predatory. "Mostly game," Elric answered truthfully. "Some produce from the farms. Grains, vegetables." A murmur spread through the others at the mention of food, their eyes lighting up in anticipation. A robust-looking beastkin, his mane as fiery as their leaders, spoke up. "If this village is as you say, raiding it could solve our food shortage." The huntsman stiffened at his words, but their fear went unnoticed, drowned by the collective growl of approval from the others. The lioness nodded. "Indeed," she said, her voice taking on an icy tinge that caused Elric's skin to prickle. "It would solve our problems." Their leader approached Elric once again. "We will raid your village," she declared, her tone broking no argument. "We won't kill anyone, but we will take what we need." Elric clenched his fists. He knew he should be furious, but all he could feel was a numbness creeping into his mind and body. All he could hear was the blood rushing in his ears. Before the huntsman could protest, she raised a hand. "You will come with us. Ensure your villagers do not resist, and no harm will come to them." Before Oren and Eddard could voice their objections, she added, "Do as we say, and you will be spared." Sensing their distress, the lioness nodded to her kin behind the huntsman, and they stepped forward to forcefully seize the huntsmen and bind them with leather ropes. As the beastkin yanked them to their feet and bound them tightly, Elric let out a low growl of annoyance. "You don't have to do this," he muttered. "We can just make a deal, like we did before. I'm sure the elders of my village can arrange something." Before he could finish, A meaty hand came crashing down on his cheek, causing him to stumble backwards against the force of the blow. Oren hissed as he fought against the restraining arms of the beastkin holding him back, while Eddard struggled against his own bonds. The one called Ro stepped forward, his teeth bared and his eyes ablaze as he spoke. "You will learn to mind your tongue, hunter." Elric fought against the haze of pain and the beginnings of fear that pulled in his stomach. A part of him wanted to shout at them, to demand an explanation for this senseless raid on his village. But he knew any such pleas would only cause more harm to himself and his companions. As he tried to regain his composure, their leader slammed her fist onto Ro's face, causing him to stumble back. "I didn't allow you to harm them, Ro," she said, her voice like the growl of a predator. "Remember your place." Elric winced at her rebuke, but Ro seemed unfazed as he lowered his head and let out a low, growling apology. Once the beastkin had secured their captives and slung the huntsmen over their shoulders, their leader led them through the forest towards Ebonheim. With each step deeper into the twilight, Elric felt a dread settle over him. He could only hope that things would go well for them all. 12. Chapter 29, Raid of the Beastkin, Part 1. The gentle rustling of the eldergrove trees sounded like a whispered symphony as Ebonheim, Bjorn, and Thorsten stepped into the sun-dappled clearing. In the center, an orderly phalanx of village guards stood at attention, garbed in their newly forged ebonwood gear. Bjorn, his muscular frame enveloped in hide armor, walked towards the guards with a sense of reverence. His hands, calloused and battle-worn, caressed the edge of a guard's ebonwood shield. "Ebonheim, come, look at this," he beckoned, his voice echoing within the forested cathedral around them. Ebonheim approached, her silken white dress rustling against the undergrowth. She ran a slender hand over the shield's grainy texture. It was as dark as the night sky, yet warm to the touch, as if the life of the tree from which it was made still resided within it. But what impressed her the most was the craftsmanship of the guard's armor. Each one was made from an intricate latticework of interwoven ebonwood fibers and plates over a sturdy layer of hardened leather, creating a defensive garment that offered excellent protection yet still allowed for freedom of movement. Each guard's shield bore the crest of Ebonheim, a stylized tree with the moon etched on the background. The Akashic system displayed the properties of the enchanted gear on her peripheral. Domain knowledge, rank 2. You can view the properties of all objects in your domain. Ebonwood shield, type, light shield, properties, plus 24 physical defense, plus 12 block, plus 13 arcane defense, plus 10 divine defense, 17 damage reduction, all. Penalties, minus 2 melee attack, minus 6 ranged attack. Ebonwood scale mail, type, medium armor, properties, plus 22 physical defense, plus 13 arcane defense, plus 10 divine defense, 15 damage reduction, all. Penalties, minus 2 melee attack, minus 2 ranged attack. Looks sturdy enough, Bjorn commented, his eyes critically appraising the guards. Much better than the leather scraps we wore before. Thorsten nodded, his lips curling into a smirk as he looked at Thorsten. Better than your fur-clad armor. PFFT, Bjorn snorted, his grin growing wider as he gave Thorsten a playful shove. "My new one is being built as we speak. I'll show you soon." Thorsten laughed and shoved him back. Ebonheim watched the men fondly, then sighed and shook her head with an affectionate smile. These two were so similar, yet so different from each other at the same time. It was always a source of entertainment to watch them banter with each other. She was curious how their new armor compared to the armor Bjorn currently wore, so she looked at its properties as well. Enchanted hide armor, type, medium armor, properties, plus 12 physical defense, plus 6 arcane defense, 6 damage reduction, kinetic, cold, penalties, minus 3 melee attack, minus 4 ranged attack. Ooh, the new armor was way more impressive. The penalties imposed on the wearer weren't as severe, but she wasn't sure if the new armor was more cumbersome compared to the leather armor the guards had worn prior. "What about their mobility?" she asked the two men. "Can they move just as well in this armor as they did with the old leather?" At this, both men paused and looked at her, their expressions sobering slightly. Thorsten turned towards the guards and asked, "How well can you move in this new armor, soldier?" One of the guards stepped forward and replied, "As well as we did in our old armor, sir." "This new one may seem cumbersome at first, but we've been practicing with it over the past week and now our movements are as good as before." The others nodded in agreement. A few even gave a confident grunt to drive their point home. Ebonheim nodded in return, satisfied with the response. "Good," she said. "Looks like it'll do just fine." As she stepped forward, the guards snapped into a more formal position, their eyes forward, hands clenched at their sides. Ebonheim moved to the first of them, her slender fingers reaching out to trace the intricate pattern of ebonwood scales embedded in the armor. She nodded approvingly as she examined the fine craftsmanship before continuing down the line, her delicate fingers gliding over the sturdy plates and smooth leather. The helm was the first to capture her attention. It was a full-face design with an open grille at the front to allow visibility and airflow, and a stiff brim to protect against arrows and projectiles. At the back, the helmet tapered into a curved crest, which jutted up to protect the back of the neck. It was a striking design, and Ebonheim marveled at the intricate beauty of it. Suddenly, one of the guards spoke up, breaking her concentration. "Oh," he said as he lowered his head and placed his fist over his chest. "It's an honor to have you examine our armor, goddess." Ebonheim grinned at him as she replied, "Don't be so formal with me." As she spoke, she straightened his armor for him. The young guard went rigid at her touch, his eyes wide as he stared at her in awe. "You're among friends," she added with a wink and a light pat on his armored shoulder before moving on to the next guard. Bjorn and Thorsten joined her, their gruff voices filling the clearing with their appraisal of the gauntlets, greaves, and other pieces of the ebonwood armor. While Bjorn focused on the details of the craftsmanship and efficiency of the armor, Thorsten's appraisal focused on the suitability of the equipment for combat. Their opinions on the armor were so similar to Ebonheim's that she could barely tell them apart, but they often bickered over minor details like their preferences in terms of armor design or its function as protection from enemy arrows or blades. "Bjorn, did you come up with this design?" she queried, pointing towards a breastplate made from a thicker slab of ebonwood with a series of scales running along its length. "I love the idea of scales here." Bjorn nodded, his blue eyes twinkling with pride. "I thought of it, but it was the crafters who brought the idea to life. They worked night and day, their hands guided by your blessings, Ebonheim." They finished their tour of the equipment and turned to regard the guards again. Thorsten gave a hearty chuckle, then bellowed at the gathered men. "With those new shields and armor, you will be the guardians of Ebonheim, the protectors of our home. Wear it with pride, wield it with honor." A cheer erupted from the guards. Ebonheim watched in satisfaction as they stood tall, their chests puffed out with pride and their weapons held aloft. Thorsten and Bjorn stood behind her as she surveyed the gathered warriors. They had trained to acclimate to the new equipment. The warriors had become stronger, more confident, and better trained as a result. Ebonheim could see it in their eyes. They were prepared, and they were willing to do what was necessary to defend their home. Cyrandil stalked through the undergrowth like a hunter on the prowl. With each step, she lifted her head and sniffed the air, her eyes scanning the shadows for any trace of movement or sound. Her warriors, 30 in number, followed behind her, their steps silent but confident as they took up their positions in the foliage around the village. End of Block 2.